Chapter 1. When Gods Walk Among Mortals, The Birth of a Monster. Welcome back to the Bedside Historian, where we uncover the darkest secrets of history's most twisted souls. If you're new here, subscribe now and ring that notification bell, because tonight's tale will haunt your dreams and make you question everything you thought you knew about power, madness, and the thin line between divinity and damnation. In the suffocating heat of a Roman summer, as the year 12 AD drew to its close, something stirred in the darkness of Antium's imperial villa. The screams that echoed through marble corridors that night were not just those of childbirth, they were the first cries of what would become Rome's most depraved emperor, a man who would redefine the very concept of evil itself. Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, entered this world under an omen of blood. As Agrippina the Elder writhed in labour, witnesses later swore they saw shadows moving against the flickering lamplight, shapes that seemed to dance with unholy glee. The midwives, their hands slick with blood and fear, would whisper for decades afterward about the child who emerged not crying like other babes, but silent, his dark eyes already seeming to hold secrets too terrible for mortal comprehension. But this was no ordinary child born into no ordinary family. The blood that flowed through his veins carried the weight of empire, the madness of the Julio-Claudian line, and most dangerously of all, the divine arrogance that would transform him from beloved prince to history's most notorious monster. His father, Germanicus, stood as Rome's greatest general, adored by legions who would follow him into the very mouth of hell. His mother, Agrippina, possessed a beauty so legendary that poets would weep merely at the sight of her shadow. Yet even as the infant Gaius drew his first breath, darkness was already gathering around this golden family like storm clouds before a hurricane. In the imperial palace, Emperor Tiberius sat brooding on his throne, his paranoid mind already spinning webs of suspicion around the too popular Germanicus. The old emperor's fingers would drum against marble armrests as reports reached him of the legion's devotion to his nephew, of how they carried the baby Gaius in their camps, dressing him in miniature soldiers' boots that earned him the nickname Caligula, Little Boots. Those soldiers, hardened veterans of Germania's bloodiest campaigns, had no way of knowing they were coddling a future tyrant. They saw only an adorable child toddling through their camps, his chubby fingers grasping at their armour, his innocent laughter echoing off shield walls. They called him their mascot, their little general, never imagining that those same small hands would one day sign death warrants with the casual indifference of a child pulling wings from flies. The Germanic campaigns that defined Caligula's earliest years were themselves a masterclass in brutality. As Germanicus carved through barbarian territories like a divine blade, young Caligula witnessed scenes that would scar lesser minds forever. He saw prisoners of war crucified along roadways, their agonized screams serving as warnings to any who dared oppose Rome's might. He watched as entire villages were put to the torch, the smoke of burning homes mixing with the acrid stench of charred flesh. But perhaps most formatively, he observed his father's magnetic command over the legions. Germanicus possessed that rarest of gifts, the ability to inspire absolute devotion through sheer force of personality. Soldiers who hadn't seen their families in years would weep openly when he spoke of Rome's glory. Veterans scarred by countless battles would throw themselves onto enemy spears if Germanicus but pointed in their direction. Young Caligula absorbed these lessons with the frightening intelligence that would later serve his darkest ambitions. He learned that power was not just about commanding obedience, it was about inspiring worship. He saw how his father could transform mortal men into instruments of his will through nothing more than carefully chosen words and theatrical gestures. These observations would later manifest in Caligula's own reign as elaborate spectacles designed not just to entertain, but to psychologically dominate his subjects. The family dynamics that shaped the future emperor's twisted psyche were equally complex and disturbing. Agrippina the Elder, despite her legendary beauty, possessed a political mind as sharp as any senator's blade. She understood that in the deadly game of imperial succession, sentiment was a luxury that could prove fatal. She raised her children, Caligula, his brothers Nero and Drusus, and his sisters Agrippina the Younger, Julia Drusilla and Julia Livilla, to see themselves not just as members of the royal family, but as living gods temporarily constrained by mortal flesh. This divine self-perception was reinforced daily through ritual and ceremony. The children were waited upon by slaves who approached them with the same reverence, typically reserved for temple statues. They ate from golden plates that bore images of their deified ancestors, constantly reminded that divine blood flowed through their veins. Young Caligula, even as a toddler, was encouraged to see common citizens as fundamentally different creatures, not quite human in the way he and his family were human. The psychological impact of this upbringing cannot be overstated. While other children learned empathy through play and interaction with peers, Caligula learned dominance through the casual exercise of power over slaves and servants. When he commanded a slave to crawl like a dog for his amusement, and that slave immediately complied, the lesson was clear. His desires were not mere wishes but divine commands that reality itself was bound to obey. Yet beneath this golden childhood lurked ever-present danger. The imperial court was a nest of vipers, where a carelessly spoken word could mean exile or death. Tiberius, growing increasingly paranoid with age, saw potential conspirators in every shadow. He particularly fixated on Germanicus's popularity, interpreting the general's success as a threat to his own authority. Spies moved through the family's household like ghosts, reporting every conversation, every gesture, every relationship that might be construed as treasonous. This atmosphere of constant surveillance created in young Caligula a preternatural awareness of how to read people's true intentions beneath their public masks. He learned to recognize the subtle signs of fear, ambition, and deception that others missed entirely. More dangerously, he began to understand how to use that knowledge to manipulate those around him, planting seeds of suspicion and discord with the casual cruelty that would later define his reign. The influence of his siblings during these formative years cannot be ignored, particularly his relationship with his sister Drusilla. Even as young children, observers noted an unusual intensity in their bond that went beyond typical sibling affection. They seemed to communicate through glances and gestures that excluded others entirely, creating a private world where normal rules and boundaries simply didn't apply. Drusilla, barely 2 years younger than Caligula, matched his intelligence and shared his growing sense that they were fundamentally different from, and superior to, everyone around them. Their games often involved elaborate fantasies where they ruled as god-emperors over imaginary kingdoms, making life and death decisions about their subjects with theatrical gravity. What other children might have recognized as mere pretend, Caligula and Drusilla approached with deadly seriousness, as if rehearsing for roles they were destined to play. Slaves pressed into service as subjects in these games quickly learned that failure to show proper reverence could result in very real punishment. As Caligula grew from infant to child, the signs of his future monstrosity became increasingly apparent to those with eyes to see. He displayed an early fascination with death that went far beyond normal childhood curiosity. He would spend hours watching gladiatorial matches, not cheering for the victor like other children, but studying the precise moment when life left the loser's eyes. He collected small animals, birds, mice, insects, not as pets, but as subjects for crude experiments in pain and mortality. Most chilling of all was his developing relationship with truth itself. Other children lied to avoid punishment or gain advantage. Caligula lied for the sheer joy of watching others believe his fabrications. He would tell elaborate stories about conversations with gods, about prophetic dreams, about miraculous events he claimed to have witnessed. The fact that adults often indulged these fantasies as charming childish imagination only reinforced his growing belief that reality was whatever he declared it to be. By the time he reached his 7th year, those closest to the family had begun to whisper among themselves about the strange intensity in the boy's dark eyes, about the cruel precision of his childish pranks, about the way servants seemed genuinely afraid of earning his displeasure. But these were dangerous whispers, spoken only in the deepest shadows, for to suggest that a member of the divine imperial family might be anything less than perfect was to invite accusations of treason. And so the monster continued to grow in plain sight, nurtured by a system that mistook his cruelty for strength, his manipulation for intelligence, and his complete lack of empathy for divine detachment. The soldiers who had nicknamed him Little Boots would live to rue the day they first hoisted him onto their shoulders. never imagining they were celebrating the rise of their future tormentor. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the greatest tragedy in Roman history was about to begin its inexorable march toward an ending that would shock the world and haunt the empire for generations to come. In the luxurious nurseries of Antium, evil wore the face of a child, and no one suspected the depths of darkness that lay behind those innocent eyes. Chapter 2: The Golden Cage, a Prince Among Vipers. The marble corridors of the imperial palace echoed with whispers that grew more urgent with each passing month. As young Caligula approached his 8th birthday, the political machinations that would ultimately shape his twisted worldview reached a fever pitch that threatened to consume not just his family, but the very foundations of the empire itself. Tiberius had retreated to the island of Capri, ostensibly for his health, but in reality to indulge in depraved pleasures that would have made even the most jaded Roman senator blanch with horror. From his island fortress, the emperor spun webs of paranoia and suspicion that ensnared everyone within reach of imperial power. His agents moved through Rome like poisonous spiders, carrying whispered accusations and manufactured evidence to feed their master's insatiable appetite for conspiracy theories. In this atmosphere of barely contained terror, Germanicus struggled to maintain his dignity and honour while protecting his family from the emperor's growing madness. The general's military brilliance had made him beloved by the legions, but that same popularity had marked him for destruction in Tiberius's paranoid mind. Every victory Germanicus won against Rome's enemies only served to increase the emperor's conviction that his nephew was plotting against him. Young Caligula observed these deadly games with the fascinated attention of a born predator studying its prey. He watched as his father navigated the treacherous currents of imperial politics, noting how a single, carelessly spoken word could transform a loyal friend into a dangerous enemy overnight. He saw how the most powerful men in the world could be reduced to trembling sycophants by nothing more than an emperor's frown. These lessons in the absolute nature of power would later manifest in his own reign as increasingly elaborate demonstrations of his divine authority. The household itself had become a battlefield where loyalty was a commodity to be bought, sold, or betrayed at a moment's notice. Slaves who had served the family faithfully for years suddenly found themselves under suspicion, accused of carrying messages to imaginary conspirators or plotting to poison their masters. The constant purges created an atmosphere where everyone watched everyone else, where children learned to distrust their own tutors and siblings learned to keep dangerous secrets from each other. Yet amidst this political chaos, the bond between Caligula and his sister Drusilla only grew stronger and more intense. While their other siblings struggled to understand the shifting alliances and deadly games that surrounded them, Caligula and Drusilla seemed to thrive in the atmosphere of danger and suspicion. They developed their own private language of glances and gestures, communicating complex thoughts without speaking a word that might be overheard by the wrong ears. Their tutors, carefully selected Greek scholars who had been brought to Rome to educate the imperial children, began to notice disturbing patterns in their behaviour during lessons. While other students might struggle with difficult concepts or show normal childhood distractibility, Caligula and Drusilla approached their studies with an intensity that bordered on obsession. They were particularly fascinated by histories of divine rulers, by stories of gods who walked among mortals, by accounts of emperors who had claimed supernatural powers. The most observant tutors noted that the siblings seemed less interested in learning about these historical figures than in studying them as examples to be emulated and improved upon. When told about Alexander the Great's claim to divine parentage, Caligula didn't react with wonder or skepticism like other children. He nodded with the serious consideration of someone evaluating a business proposal. When Drusilla heard stories of Egyptian pharaohs who had married their sisters to preserve divine bloodlines, she exchanged meaningful looks with her brother that made their teachers profoundly uncomfortable. Their education extended far beyond traditional academic subjects. As members of the imperial family, they were taught the arts of war, statecraft, and public speaking that would theoretically prepare them for future roles in governing the empire. But these lessons took on a darker cast when filtered through their developing psyches. Military tactics became exercises in maximizing suffering rather than achieving strategic objectives. Lessons in rhetoric became training in manipulation and psychological domination. Most disturbing of all were their exercises in what their tutors euphemistically called administrative decision-making. Presented with hypothetical scenarios involving rebellious provinces or troublesome senators, other imperial children might suggest diplomatic solutions or reasonable punishments. Caligula and Drusilla invariably proposed responses of such elaborate cruelty that their teachers struggled to maintain their composure while explaining why such measures might be considered excessive. The siblings' relationship with their younger sisters and brothers grew increasingly complex and troubling during this period. Agrippina the Younger, Julia Livilla, Nero and Drusus all possessed their own ambitions and intelligence, but none could match the dark charisma that seemed to emanate from Caligula and Drusilla like heat from a forge. The younger children found themselves drawn into elaborate games and schemes that they didn't fully understand, serving as unwitting pawns in their siblings' increasingly sophisticated manipulations. These family dynamics were further complicated by the constant presence of death that hung over the imperial household like a funeral shroud. Friends and relatives disappeared with alarming regularity, sometimes dying of mysterious illnesses, sometimes simply vanishing without explanation. The children learned not to ask too many questions about these disappearances, but the lessons were clear. In the world of imperial politics, and survival depended on understanding who held power, and how that power might be used against you. The physical environment of their upbringing reinforced these psychological pressures at every turn. The palace walls were decorated with frescoes depicting the glorious victories of their ancestors, but also with more subtle imagery that spoke to the divine nature of imperial authority. Statues of deified emperors lined the corridors, their marble eyes seeming to watch and judge everyone who passed beneath them. The very architecture seemed designed to remind the inhabitants that they were living in a space between the mortal and divine worlds. Caligula absorbed these environmental messages with an intensity that troubled even the most sycophantic courtiers. He would spend hours standing before statues of Augustus or Julius Caesar, not in the reverent contemplation that might be expected of a child, but with the calculating gaze of someone planning to surpass their achievements. Servants reported that they had discovered him talking to these statues in hushed tones, as if receiving instructions from the divine ancestors themselves. His relationship with the palace slaves provided perhaps the clearest early indication of the monster he was destined to become. While other imperial children might be indulgent or even kind to their servants, viewing them as extensions of their own household, Caligula approached these relationships as opportunities to exercise and refine his growing understanding of absolute power. He would issue contradictory commands to the same slave within minutes of each other, then punish them for failing to comply with impossible demands. These exercises in casual cruelty were conducted with the methodical precision of someone conducting scientific experiments. Caligula seemed genuinely curious about how much psychological pressure a human being could endure before breaking entirely. He would push slaves to their limits, then observe their reactions with the detached interest of a natural philosopher studying interesting specimens. The palace physicians, called to treat servants who had suffered mysterious accidents or sudden illnesses, began to notice patterns that they dared not voice aloud. Injuries that seemed designed to cause maximum pain while leaving no permanent damage. Poisonings that stopped just short of being fatal. These were not the random cruelties of an undisciplined child, but the calculated experiments of a developing sociopath who was learning to use suffering as a tool of control. Religious ceremonies provided another venue for Caligula's psychological development, though perhaps not in the way their organisers intended. The imperial family was expected to participate in elaborate rituals that reinforced their divine connection to the gods, but young Caligula approached these ceremonies with a disturbing literalism that made even the most devoted priests uncomfortable. When told that he carried divine blood, he didn't treat this as symbolic language. He believed it with the absolute conviction of revealed truth. During sacrificial ceremonies, while other children might be appropriately reverent or even squeamish at the sight of blood, Caligula watched with rapt attention as animals were slaughtered on altar stones. He studied the precise movements of the priests' knives, the way blood pooled in sacred vessels, the moment when life departed from the sacrifice's eyes. These observations weren't motivated by morbid curiosity, but by a genuine desire to understand the mechanics of divine power over life and death. The priest began to report disturbing conversations with the young prince, encounters where he asked probing questions about the nature of godhood that went far beyond normal childhood curiosity. He wanted to know exactly what separated gods from mortals, whether divine power could be acquired or was purely inherited, and most disturbingly, whether the gods themselves were subject to any limitations or moral constraints. As political tensions within the imperial family reached their breaking point, young Caligula found himself uniquely positioned to observe the deadly consequences of challenging imperial authority. Relatives who fell under suspicion didn't simply disappear quietly, they were destroyed publicly and thoroughly, their reputations shattered, their wealth confiscated, their very names becoming curses that no loyal citizen dared speak aloud. These demonstrations of absolute power left profound impressions on Caligula's developing psyche. He learned that emperors didn't merely rule through law and tradition, they shaped reality itself through the application of divine will. When Tiberius declared someone an enemy of the state, that person didn't just lose their legal status, they ceased to exist as a meaningful part of the world. This godlike ability to remake reality according to personal whim would become the central obsession of Caligula's eventual reign. The contrast between his family's public image and private reality created in young Caligula a sophisticated understanding of the theatrical nature of power. In public ceremonies, they were portrayed as the perfect imperial family, noble, virtuous, beloved by gods and citizens alike. In private, they lived in constant fear, surrounded by spies and assassins, never certain whether tomorrow would bring elevation or destruction. This duality taught Caligula that truth was not an objective reality, but a performance to be staged for different audiences. The same act could be virtuous or treasonous, depending entirely on who was watching and what they chose to believe. This understanding would later manifest in his reign through increasingly elaborate spectacles designed not just to entertain, but to psychologically dominate his subjects by forcing them to participate in his version of reality. As his 8th year drew to a close, the various forces that would shape Caligula's destiny were converging toward an inevitable climax. Germanicus's popularity had reached levels that Tiberius could no longer tolerate, while the general's own honour prevented him from taking the decisive action that might have saved his family. The stage was set for a tragedy that would transform a precocious, but still potentially salvageable child into the monster that would haunt Rome for generations to come. The golden cage was closing around them all, but young Caligula was perhaps the only one who understood that cages could serve multiple purposes. They could imprison, but they could also protect the truly dangerous creatures within them from a world that wasn't yet ready to face their full fury. Soon, very soon, that cage would be opened and Rome would learn what horrors had been growing in the shadows of imperial privilege. Chapter 3. Blood and Shadows, The Making of a Tyrant. The Syrian sun beat down mercilessly on the military encampment where destiny waited to claim its next victim. Germanicus, Rome's greatest general, lay dying in a tent that reeked of poison and political murder, while his 9-year-old son Caligula watched from the shadows, absorbing lessons in betrayal that would echo through the corridors of imperial power for decades to come. The official cause would be listed as fever, a convenient explanation that fooled no one who understood the deadly mathematics of imperial succession. But Caligula, precocious beyond his years and already versed in the subtle languages of court intrigue, recognized the truth with crystal clarity. His beloved father was being murdered by order of Emperor Tiberius, killed not for any crime he had committed, but for the unforgivable sin of being too popular, too competent, too dangerous to the paranoid emperor's tenuous grip on power. As Germanicus's life ebbed away drop by agonizing drop, young Caligula experienced a transformation that would fundamentally alter not just his own destiny, but the fate of the Roman Empire itself. The innocent child who had once toddled through military camps in miniature soldiers' boots was dying alongside his father, replaced by something darker, more calculating, infinitely more dangerous. In the space of those terrible days, watching the strongest man he had ever known reduced to a writhing, poison-racked shadow of himself, Caligula learned the most important lesson of his young life. In the world of absolute power, love was weakness, trust was fatal, and mercy was a luxury that only the naive could afford. The symptoms had appeared gradually. almost casually, as if death itself were taking its time to savour the destruction of Rome's greatest hero. Germanicus had begun complaining of headaches and stomach pains following a dinner with Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso, the Syrian governor whose loyalty to Tiberius was matched only by his hatred for the popular general. What started as minor discomfort quickly escalated into violent convulsions, bloody vomit, and the kind of systematic organ failure that spoke to the work of a master poisoner, rather than natural disease. Caligula haunted the edges of his father's sick room like a small dark ghost, his intelligent eyes missing nothing as he watched the most powerful men in the Roman world reveal their true natures under pressure. He saw senators who had once competed for Germanicus's attention suddenly discover urgent business elsewhere. He observed supposed friends carefully distancing themselves from a family that was clearly falling from imperial favour. Most importantly, he witnessed the complete helplessness of even the mightiest mortals when confronted with the implacable will of an emperor who had decided they must die. The political implications of Germanicus's murder were not lost on the boy who would one day wield that same deadly power. Tiberius was demonstrating a fundamental truth about imperial authority. It was not enough to merely rule. An emperor must be willing to destroy anyone who might potentially challenge that rule, regardless of their loyalty, their virtue, or their usefulness to the state. Blood ties, military genius, popular acclaim, none of these provided protection against an emperor who felt threatened. Agrippina, the elder's reaction to her husband's murder, provided young Caligula with an equally instructive lesson in the dangers of righteous fury. His mother made no attempt to hide her conviction that Germanicus had been poisoned, nor her determination to see justice done for this monstrous crime. She raged against Piso, demanded investigations, appealed to senators and citizens alike to recognize the truth of what had happened. Her passion was magnificent, her cause was just, and her efforts were completely, utterly futile. Caligula watched his mother's crusade for justice with the fascination of someone studying a particularly elaborate form of suicide. He saw how her public accusations against Piso were subtly redirected into accusations against Tiberius himself. He observed how her demands for investigation were transformed by skilled propagandists into evidence of her own disloyalty to the emperor. Most crucially, he learned that in the world of imperial politics, being right was often far more dangerous than being wrong. The journey back to Rome became a masterclass in political theatre that would profoundly influence Caligula's later understanding of how to manipulate public opinion. Agrippina carried Germanicus's ashes in a golden urn, making sure that crowds gathered at every stop to witness her grief, and by extension, to contemplate the injustice of his death. The displays of public mourning were genuine and overwhelming. Entire cities turned out to honour the fallen hero, their tears and lamentations creating a groundswell of popular sentiment that should have been politically powerful. But young Caligula, observing these demonstrations with the cold calculation that was already becoming his trademark, recognised a fundamental flaw in his mother's strategy. Popular sentiment, no matter how passionate or widespread, was meaningless unless it could be converted into actual political power. Crowds might weep for Germanicus and curse his murderers, but when the spectacle ended, they returned to their daily lives while Tiberius continued to rule from his fortress on Capri. Emotion without the means to enforce action was merely theatre, and Caligula filed this lesson away for future reference. The formal reception in Rome provided the final act in this tragedy of political miscalculation. Tiberius, demonstrating the kind of cynical brilliance that had kept him alive in the deadly game of imperial succession, orchestrated a public funeral that simultaneously honoured Germanicus and neutralised the threat his death might have posed to imperial stability. The ceremony was magnificent, the eulogies were appropriately moving, and the entire event served to channel popular outrage into acceptable mourning rituals rather than dangerous political action. Caligula stood silent throughout the proceedings, his dark eyes recording every detail of how absolute power could transform even genuine tragedy into carefully orchestrated propaganda. He watched senators deliver speeches praising Germanicus's loyalty and virtue while carefully avoiding any suggestion that his death might have been anything other than natural. He observed how Tiberius managed to appear genuinely grief-stricken while simultaneously demonstrating to everyone present exactly what happened to those who became too popular or too powerful. The immediate aftermath of Germanicus's death brought changes to the imperial household that further accelerated Caligula's psychological development. With their primary protector gone, the family's status shifted from honoured relatives to potential threats that needed to be carefully monitored and controlled. The surveillance that had always been present became overt and oppressive, with agents reporting not just their movements and conversations, but their moods, their relationships, even their dreams. This constant observation created in young Caligula an acute awareness of the performative nature of existence within the imperial court. He learned to present different faces to different audiences, to modulate his expressions and responses according to who might be watching and what they might report to their masters. This skill in psychological manipulation, developed as a survival mechanism during his childhood, would later become one of his most powerful tools for controlling and terrorizing his subjects. The relationship between Caligula and his sister Drusilla underwent a profound transformation during this period of mourning and uncertainty. Faced with a world that had suddenly become infinitely more dangerous and unpredictable, they turned to each other with an intensity that transcended normal sibling bonds. They became co-conspirators in their own survival, developing elaborate private rituals and secret communications that excluded not just the imperial spies, but their own family members. Their conversations during this period, overheard and reported by particularly skilled eavesdroppers, revealed a disturbing preoccupation with power and its uses. Rather than grieving their father's death like normal children, they seemed to study it as a case study in political failure. They analysed Germanicus's mistakes, identified the weaknesses that had made him vulnerable, and began developing theories about how they might avoid similar fates when their turn came to navigate the deadly currents of imperial politics. Most chilling of all was their growing fascination with Tiberius himself, whom they discussed not as their father's murderer, but as a master craftsman worthy of careful study. They recognised the emperor's genius for political survival, his ability to eliminate threats while maintaining plausible deniability, his skill at using other people's virtues against them. These conversations revealed an almost complete absence of moral judgment. They were not outraged by Tiberius's crimes, but impressed by his technique. The educational program that had been designed to prepare Caligula for potential future responsibilities continued, but now took on a distinctly different character. His tutors, acutely aware that they were teaching someone who might one day hold the power of life and death over them, began emphasizing lessons that they hoped might instill proper moral principles. They focused on the great philosopher emperors of the past, on leaders who had used their power wisely and justly, on the importance of virtue and restraint in governance. But these well-intentioned lessons had exactly the opposite effect from what their teachers intended. Rather than inspiring Caligula to emulate virtuous rulers, they provided him with detailed case studies of political weakness and failure. He learned that Marcus Aurelius's philosophical principles had made him ineffective in dealing with military crises. He discovered that previous emperors' attempts at clemency had often been rewarded with rebellion and betrayal. Most importantly, he concluded that virtue was not just useless in the exercise of absolute power, it was actively dangerous. The contrast between his official education and the practical lessons he was learning from direct observation created in Caligula a sophisticated understanding of the gap between public morality and private necessity. He learned to speak eloquently about justice, mercy, and the responsibilities of leadership, while privately developing an entirely different set of principles based on survival, dominance, and the strategic use of fear. His relationship with the palace slaves continued to provide opportunities for experimentation with power dynamics, but these exercises became more sophisticated and psychologically complex following his father's death. Rather than simple cruelty, Caligula began developing elaborate systems of reward and punishment designed to test the limits of human loyalty and obedience. He would grant unexpected privileges to certain slaves, while simultaneously subjecting others to seemingly arbitrary punishments, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty that made everyone desperate to please him, while never quite understanding how to succeed. These psychological experiments taught him invaluable lessons about human nature that would later serve him well as emperor. He learned that people were more effectively controlled through unpredictability than through consistent harshness. He discovered that hope was often more powerful than fear as a motivational tool, provided that hope remained forever just out of reach. Most importantly, he began to understand how individual psychology could be systematically manipulated to serve his purposes. Religious observances took on new significance for Caligula during this period of political and personal upheaval. The elaborate ceremonies that marked the imperial family's relationship with the gods became opportunities for him to explore questions about the nature of divine power and its relationship to earthly authority. He paid particular attention to rituals involving the deification of deceased emperors, studying the precise mechanisms by which mortal men were transformed into objects of worship. The priests conducting these ceremonies began to report increasingly sophisticated theological discussions with the young prince, conversations that revealed a disturbing literal-mindedness about divine authority. When told that emperors became gods after death, Caligula wanted to understand exactly what powers this transformation conveyed, whether divine status could be claimed by living emperors, and most troublingly, whether gods were subject to the same moral constraints that supposedly governed mortal behaviour. These theological investigations were not driven by genuine religious devotion, but by practical considerations about the potential scope of imperial power. Caligula was developing a theoretical framework that would eventually justify the most extreme exercises of tyrannical authority by grounding them in claims of divine mandate. If he was truly a god, then his desires became by definition righteous, his commands became sacred law, and opposition to his will became not just treason, but blasphemy. As his 10th birthday approached, young Caligula had completed a transformation that would have horrified those who had known him as an innocent child toddling through military camps. The murder of his father had stripped away any remaining illusions about the nature of power and its uses, while his mother's failed quest for justice had demonstrated the futility of moral outrage in the face of absolute authority. He had learned to see the world as a vast theatre where survival depended on superior performance, where empathy was weakness, and where the only meaningful distinction between people was their capacity to serve or threaten his interests. The stage was set for the next phase of his development, a period that would see him thrust directly into the centre of imperial politics as Tiberius, increasingly isolated on his island fortress, began to contemplate the question of succession. The boy who had once been Rome's beloved mascot was about to become its most dangerous predator, armed with lessons in cruelty that would reshape the empire itself. The blood of his father had watered the ground where a monster was growing, and soon that monster would be ready to claim its inheritance of absolute power over the greatest civilization the world had ever known. Chapter 4. The Spider's Web. A young prince. Learns to hunt. The years following Germanicus's murder transformed the imperial court into a hunting ground, where survival depended not on strength or virtue, but on an almost supernatural ability to sense danger before it struck. As young Caligula entered his 12th year, he had already begun to demonstrate a talent for this deadly game that surpassed even the most experienced courtiers who had spent decades perfecting their skills in political predation. Tiberius, now permanently ensconced on his island fortress of Capri, had created a system of governance that operated through fear, suspicion, and the constant threat of sudden, inexplicable destruction. His agents moved through Rome like invisible plague carriers, spreading paranoia and manufacturing conspiracies that justified increasingly brutal purges of anyone who might pose even a theoretical threat to imperial authority. In this atmosphere of institutionalized terror, Caligula thrived with the natural ease of a creature perfectly adapted to its environment. The boy who had once been carried through military camps as a beloved mascot now moved through the palace corridors with the calculated grace of a born predator studying potential prey. His tutors, initially relieved that their young charge seemed to be adapting well to the new political realities, gradually began to notice disturbing changes in his behaviour that suggested his adaptation might be proceeding in directions they had never intended. Where other members of the imperial family responded to the climate of suspicion with increased caution and withdrawal, Caligula seemed to view it as an opportunity for advancement. He cultivated relationships with Tiberius's agents, not as a means of protection, but as a way of gathering intelligence about the emperor's methods and priorities. These conversations, carefully orchestrated to appear casual and innocent, provided him with detailed insights into how absolute power actually functioned behind its public facade. The agents themselves, hardened veterans of decades spent in the service of imperial paranoia, found themselves oddly charmed by the young prince's apparent fascination with their work. They interpreted his probing questions about surveillance techniques and interrogation methods as the natural curiosity of an intelligent child rather than the systematic intelligence gathering of a future tyrant learning his trade. They shared stories of successful operations, explained the psychology of effective intimidation, and unwittingly provided him with a graduate education in the practical applications of systematic terror. Caligula absorbed these lessons with the focused intensity of someone preparing for a career that would require mastery of every aspect of human manipulation. He learned how to identify the subtle signs that indicated someone was concealing dangerous thoughts or planning treacherous actions. He studied the methods by which loyal citizens could be transformed into enthusiastic informants against their own friends and family members. Most importantly, he began to understand how the mere possibility of surveillance could be more effective than actual monitoring in controlling behaviour on a mass scale. His relationship with his sister Drusilla continued to deepen in ways that made even the most jaded courtiers profoundly uncomfortable. Their private conversations, when fragments were overheard by servants or detected by hidden listeners, revealed an intimacy that went far beyond normal sibling affection. They spoke to each other in voices so low they were barely audible, their heads bent close together in a manner that suggested shared secrets too dangerous for any other ears to hear. The content of these whispered exchanges, pieced together from multiple sources over many months, painted a picture of two young minds working in perfect coordination to analyse and manipulate the deadly political currents that surrounded them. They discussed other family members not as relatives to be protected or loved, but as assets to be managed or obstacles to be neutralised. They evaluated the loyalty and usefulness of various courtiers with the cold precision of military strategists planning a campaign. Most disturbing of all were their conversations about Tiberius himself, whom they discussed with a mixture of grudging admiration and calculating assessment. They recognised the emperor's genius for political survival, while simultaneously analysing his weaknesses and vulnerabilities. These were not the discussions of children contemplating a distant authority figure, but the planning sessions of potential successors already preparing for the day when they might need to eliminate an inconvenient predecessor. The physical manifestation of their relationship had also begun to attract unwanted attention from observers who possessed sufficient experience to recognise dangerous patterns when they emerged. Palace servants reported glimpses of interactions between the siblings that suggested a level of physical intimacy inappropriate for their ages and relationship. These reports were carefully buried by officials who understood that such accusations, even if true, were far too dangerous to investigate formally. But the whispers persisted, carried by slaves and freedmen who had witnessed scenes that challenged their understanding of proper behaviour within even the most unconventional imperial household. Stories circulated of late-night visits between their chambers, of embraces that lasted too long and touched too intimately, of conversations punctuated by caresses that would have been scandalous between unrelated individuals of their ages. These rumours, whether accurate or exaggerated, served an important function in Caligula's developing understanding of how to use scandal and transgression as tools of political control. He began to recognise that the mere suggestion of behaviour that violated social taboos could be more powerful than actual violations in creating an atmosphere of uncertainty and fear among potential opponents. People who might resist direct threats could be paralysed by implications that their resistance might expose them to accusations of complicity in unspeakable acts. The formal education that had been designed to prepare him for eventual responsibilities within the imperial system continued, but now operated under dramatically changed circumstances. His tutors, acutely aware that they were teaching someone who might one day possess the power to order their execution, began to modify their curriculum in ways that reflected both their hopes for his moral development and their fears about his emerging character. They emphasised repeatedly the importance of justice, mercy and restraint in the exercise of power, using historical examples to illustrate how the greatest rulers had been those who used their authority for the benefit of their subjects rather than their own gratification. They assigned readings from the great moral philosophers, organised discussions about ethical governance, and attempted to instill principles that might serve as guardrails against the abuse of absolute power. But these well-intentioned lessons had the unintended effect of providing Caligula with detailed case studies in political weakness and failure. When his tutors spoke admiringly of rulers who had shown mercy to defeated enemies, he heard accounts of missed opportunities to eliminate future threats. When they praised emperors who had consulted with the Senate before making important decisions, he learned about unnecessary constraints on imperial authority that had prevented decisive action. Most dangerously, his tutors' emphasis on moral principles taught him to recognize virtue as a manipulable weakness in others rather than a strength to be cultivated in himself. He began to understand how people's ethical commitments could be used against them, how their desire to do good could be exploited to serve his purposes, how their moral constraints could prevent them from taking effective action against someone who operated without such limitations. The religious dimensions of his education took on particular significance during this period, as questions about the divine nature of imperial authority became increasingly relevant to his developing worldview. The priests responsible for instructing him in proper ritual observances found themselves fielding increasingly sophisticated theological questions that revealed a disturbing literalism about claims of imperial divinity. When told that Augustus had been declared a god after his death, Caligula wanted to understand the precise mechanism by which this transformation had occurred and whether it might be possible to accelerate the process. When instructed about the emperor's role as Pontifex Maximus, he focused not on the ceremonial responsibilities, but on the theoretical scope of religious authority this position conveyed. When participating in sacrificial rituals, he paid careful attention to the techniques by which priests manipulated the interpretation of omens to support predetermined political conclusions. These theological investigations were not motivated by genuine spiritual curiosity, but by practical considerations about the potential uses of religious authority in consolidating and expanding political power. Caligula was developing a theoretical framework that would eventually allow him to claim divine status as a living emperor, transforming what had traditionally been a posthumous honour into an immediate tool of political control. His interactions with the broader imperial household during this period provided additional opportunities for him to refine his understanding of human psychology and its manipulation. The palace was populated by hundreds of slaves, freedmen, and minor officials whose survival depended entirely on their ability to anticipate and satisfy the desires of their social superiors. This created a laboratory environment where Caligula could experiment with different approaches to exercising authority over people who had no choice but to submit to his will. These experiments began simply enough, with tests of how quickly and completely servants would comply with increasingly arbitrary commands. But they gradually evolved into more sophisticated psychological manipulations designed to explore the limits of human obedience and the methods by which individual identity could be systematically destroyed and rebuilt according to his specifications. He discovered that people could be more effectively controlled through the strategic alternation of kindness and cruelty than through consistent harshness. Servants who received unexpected rewards for their service became desperately eager to please, while those subjected to seemingly random punishments lived in constant terror of triggering his displeasure. This combination created an atmosphere where everyone competed frantically for his approval, while never being entirely certain what actions might earn his favour or his wrath. The palace physicians, called to treat servants who had suffered various accidents and illnesses, began to notice patterns that they dared not discuss openly. Injuries that seemed calculated to cause maximum psychological trauma without permanent physical damage. Illnesses that appeared to have been induced through careful manipulation of diet and environment. These were not random acts of adolescent cruelty, but systematic experiments in human psychology conducted by someone who was learning to use suffering as a precision instrument. Political events during this crucial period of Caligula's development provided him with front-row seats to observe how absolute power functioned when wielded by a true master of the craft. Tiberius's purges had reached industrial levels of efficiency, with entire networks of supposed conspirators being eliminated through a combination of judicial murder and strategic character assassination that left their associates too terrified to question the official narratives. The case of Sejanus, Tiberius's former right-hand man who had been elevated to unprecedented heights, before being dramatically destroyed, provided particularly valuable lessons in the uses and limitations of delegated authority. Caligula studied the rise and fall of this would-be power broker with the fascination of someone learning about professional techniques that he might one day need to employ himself. He recognized that Sejanus's mistake had not been in accumulating too much power, but in allowing that power to become visible enough to threaten the emperor's sense of absolute supremacy. The prefect had forgotten that in a system of absolute monarchy, there could be only one sun around which all other celestial bodies orbited. This lesson would later influence Caligula's approach to managing subordinates, leading him to develop techniques for ensuring that no potential rival could accumulate enough independent authority to pose a meaningful threat. The methodical destruction of Sejanus's entire network demonstrated another crucial aspect of imperial authority that Caligula filed away for future reference. Tiberius had not simply executed the man himself, but had systematically eliminated everyone who might have been loyal to him, everyone who had benefited from his patronage, and everyone who might potentially serve as a focal point for future opposition. This thoroughness ensured that the threat was not just neutralized, but completely eradicated, leaving no seeds from which future problems might grow. As his 13th birthday approached, Caligula had completed another crucial phase in his transformation, from imperial prince to potential tyrant. The skills he had developed during this period, the ability to read and manipulate human psychology, the understanding of how terror could be used as a tool of governance, the recognition that moral principles were weaknesses to be exploited rather than strengths to be cultivated, would serve him well in the increasingly dangerous political environment that awaited him as he moved closer to the centre of imperial power. The web was being woven thread by thread, and at its centre sat a spider who was learning to be patient, to be thorough, and above all to be absolutely merciless when the time came to strike. Soon, very soon, that patience would be rewarded, and Rome would discover what kind of monster it had been nurturing in the shadows of imperial privilege. Chapter 5. The Island of Shadows, Dancing with the Devil. The boat that carried 15-year-old Caligula across the wine-dark waters to Capri might as well have been Charon's ferry crossing the river Styx, for the young man who disembarked on that cursed island would never again be entirely human. Behind him lay the relative innocence of adolescence, however corrupted that innocence had already become. Ahead lay an education in the deepest mysteries of absolute power that would transform him from a promising sociopath into history's most notorious monster. Tiberius had summoned his grand-nephew to join him in his island fortress, for reasons that remained opaque to everyone except the emperor himself. Official proclamations spoke vaguely of providing the young prince with advanced instruction in statecraft and governance, preparing him for the responsibilities he would one day inherit as a member of the imperial family. But those who understood the true nature of Capri's dark secrets suspected that Tiberius had far more complex and disturbing motivations for exposing an impressionable teenager to the horrors that flourished in his private kingdom. The island itself seemed designed by malevolent gods as a perfect setting for the corruption of innocence and the cultivation of evil. Its towering cliffs provided absolute isolation from the outside world, while its hidden grottos and secret chambers offered unlimited opportunities for indulgences that would have shocked even the most debauched Roman nobles. Here, beyond the reach of law, tradition, or public scrutiny, Tiberius had created a realm where every conceivable desire could be satisfied and every forbidden pleasure could be explored without consequence. Caligula's first glimpse of his great-uncle in 3 years revealed the physical toll that absolute power and unlimited indulgence had taken on the aging emperor. The man who had once been Rome's most capable general and shrewdest politician had been transformed into something that barely resembled human form. His skin, mottled with disease and excess, stretched taut over bones that seemed too fragile to support even his diminished weight. His eyes, once sharp enough to penetrate the most elaborate deceptions, now burned with a fever that spoke of minds pushed far beyond the boundaries of sanity. But it was not Tiberius's physical deterioration that made the strongest impression on his young guest. It was the emperor's obvious delight at having secured a new audience for performances that had grown stale through repetition with his usual companions. The old man's face lit up with an enthusiasm that was genuinely terrifying in its intensity, as he contemplated the possibilities that Caligula's presence offered for entertainment that had become increasingly difficult to achieve through conventional means. The villa that would serve as Caligula's home for the next 2 years was itself a monument to the systematic violation of every principle that had once guided Roman civilization. Its walls were decorated with frescoes that depicted acts so depraved that even experienced courtiers averted their eyes when passing through certain corridors. Its chambers were equipped with devices whose purposes became horrifically clear only when they were demonstrated on living subjects who had somehow earned the emperor's displeasure. Most disturbing of all were the villa's permanent residents, a collection of slaves, freedmen, and fallen nobles who had been transformed through years of systematic abuse into creatures that served Tiberius's pleasure, while retaining just enough humanity to understand and suffer from their degradation. These walking reminders of what absolute power could do to the human spirit served as both entertainment and education for the young prince, who was learning to see suffering not as something to be avoided or alleviated, but as raw material to be shaped according to his artistic vision. Caligula's education during this period operated on multiple levels simultaneously, creating a comprehensive curriculum in tyranny that far exceeded anything he might have learned through formal instruction. On the surface, he continued to receive lessons in history, philosophy and rhetoric from tutors who had been carefully selected for their ability to maintain their composure while operating in an environment that would have driven lesser men to madness or suicide. But the real education took place during the long evenings when Tiberius would summon his young guests to witness demonstrations of imperial authority that pushed the boundaries of human endurance and imagination. These were not random acts of cruelty, but carefully orchestrated performances designed to illustrate specific principles about the nature of power and its relationship to human suffering. Through systematic observation of these demonstrations, Caligula learned that pain was not simply a byproduct of governance, but could be refined into an art form that served multiple purposes simultaneously. Physical suffering could break the will of even the strongest opponents, but psychological torment could achieve more elegant results by transforming enemies into enthusiastic collaborators who participated in their own destruction. The key was understanding exactly which combination of techniques would produce the desired outcome in each specific case. Tiberius took particular pleasure in explaining the theoretical foundations underlying his practical demonstrations. He would discourse at length about the psychology of fear, the sociology of submission, and the philosophy of absolute authority while his victims writhed in carefully calibrated agony nearby. These lectures were delivered in the same measured tones that a traditional tutor might use when explaining principles of mathematics or natural philosophy, creating a surreal atmosphere where the most profound evil was discussed as if it were merely another academic subject. The emperor's favourite theme during these educational sessions was the fundamental dishonesty of conventional morality and its complete irrelevance to the practical business of governing human societies. He argued that concepts like justice, mercy, and compassion were beautiful lies told by the weak to constrain the strong, designed to prevent superior beings from exercising their natural authority over inferior creatures. True wisdom, he insisted, lay in recognizing that might was the only meaningful right, and that those with the power to impose their will had not just the ability but the obligation to do so without restraint. These philosophical discussions had a profound impact on Caligula's developing worldview, providing him with intellectual frameworks that transformed his natural cruelty from mere sadistic impulse into a coherent system of beliefs about his place in the natural order. He began to see himself not as someone who chose to be cruel, but as someone who had achieved sufficient wisdom to recognize that conventional moral constraints were artificial limitations imposed by inferior minds on superior beings. The practical applications of these theoretical principles were demonstrated daily through Tiberius's management of the island's population and his occasional interventions in Roman politics from his remote fortress. Caligula observed how the emperor could manipulate people's behaviour through the strategic application of hope and fear, how individual psychology could be systematically analysed and exploited, how entire populations could be controlled through carefully orchestrated displays of arbitrary power. One particularly instructive episode involved a group of senators who had made the mistake of questioning some minor aspect of imperial policy in what they imagined was a private conversation. Tiberius had arranged for their words to be reported to him, then summoned them to Capri under the pretense of seeking their counsel on important matters of state. The elaborate psychological torture that followed, conducted over several weeks with the precision of a master craftsman working on his greatest creation, provided Caligula with detailed insights into how terror could be used not just to punish enemies, but to transform them into useful tools. The senators arrived on Capri believing they were honoured guests invited to participate in important governmental decisions. They departed as broken men who would spend the rest of their lives desperately trying to anticipate and satisfy Tiberius's desires, while never being entirely certain what actions might trigger his displeasure. The transformation had been achieved without any permanent physical harm, making it a masterpiece of psychological manipulation that Caligula studied with the reverent attention of an art student observing the techniques of a recognised master. Perhaps even more educational were Caligula's observations of how Tiberius managed his relationships with his closest associates, the small circle of advisors, entertainers, and companions who had chosen to share his exile from conventional Roman society. These individuals, many of whom possessed considerable intelligence and political sophistication, had willingly entered into arrangements that made them completely dependent on imperial favour, while providing them with access to pleasures and powers that would have been impossible in the outside world. Caligula learned to recognise the subtle dynamics that kept these relationships stable, despite their fundamentally exploitative nature. He saw how Tiberius provided his companions with just enough genuine affection and material benefit to make their situations preferable to any available alternatives, while simultaneously ensuring that they remained too compromised by their participation in his crimes to ever consider betrayal as a realistic option. The emperor's treatment of his sexual partners provided particularly valuable lessons in the psychology of domination and submission. Tiberius had assembled a collection of young men and women whose beauty was matched only by their complete psychological dependence on his approval and protection. These individuals competed frantically for his attention, while simultaneously living in constant terror that some minor displeasure might result in their replacement by fresher faces from the steady stream of new arrivals that the emperor's agents procured from across the empire. Caligula studied these relationships with the clinical detachment of a natural philosopher investigating interesting specimens, noting how different personality types responded to various forms of manipulation and control. He learned to identify the specific psychological vulnerabilities that made individuals susceptible to particular forms of exploitation, and began developing techniques for systematically breaking down someone's sense of individual identity until they existed purely as extensions of his own will. The religious dimensions of life on Capri provided another avenue for Caligula's education in the practical applications of absolute authority. Tiberius had transformed the island's temples into venues for ceremonies that bore only superficial resemblance to traditional Roman religious observances. These rituals combined genuine theological elements with psychological manipulation techniques designed to reinforce the participants' sense of the emperor's divine authority, while gradually eroding their connection to conventional moral frameworks. Caligula participated in these ceremonies with the same analytical intensity that he brought to every other aspect of his education, studying how religious symbolism and ritual could be weaponized to serve political purposes. He learned how ancient traditions could be subtly modified to support new ideological frameworks, how sacred texts could be reinterpreted to justify previously unthinkable actions, how the human need for transcendent meaning could be redirected to serve earthly ambitions. Most importantly, he began to understand how claims of divine authority could be used not just to justify the exercise of power, but to transform the psychological relationship between ruler and subject in ways that made resistance literally unthinkable. When people genuinely believed that their emperor was a god, opposition became not just politically dangerous, but spiritually impossible, since it required them to conceive of themselves as capable of judging divine will. The correspondence that arrived regularly from Rome provided Caligula with opportunities to observe how Tiberius maintained control over the empire's vast bureaucratic machinery while remaining physically isolated from the capital. The emperor's letters to various officials demonstrated masterful techniques for managing subordinates through the strategic combination of explicit threats and implied promises, creating networks of fear and ambition that functioned effectively without requiring his direct personal supervision. These administrative lessons proved invaluable in teaching Caligula how absolute power actually functioned on a practical level. He learned that successful tyranny required not just the willingness to use violence, but the intelligence to use it efficiently and strategically. Random cruelty might satisfy personal sadistic impulses, but systematic terror served the broader purpose of creating predictable behavioural patterns that made governance more efficient and effective. As his 17th birthday approached, Caligula had completed the most crucial phase of his education in the arts of absolute power. The skills he had acquired during his time on Capri, the ability to recognise and exploit human psychological vulnerabilities, the understanding of how terror could be used as a tool of governance, the recognition that moral constraints were arbitrary limitations that superior beings could transcend, would serve as the foundation for a reign that would push the boundaries of tyrannical excess far beyond anything the ancient world had previously witnessed. The young man who prepared to leave Capri bore little resemblance to the adolescent who had arrived 2 years earlier. The final traces of conventional human empathy had been systematically eliminated through prolonged exposure to suffering that he had been taught to view as entertainment rather than tragedy. The moral frameworks that might have provided guardrails against the abuse of power had been replaced by philosophical systems that celebrated cruelty as wisdom and domination as virtue. Most dangerously of all, he had learned to see himself not as a human being constrained by the ethical limitations that governed lesser mortals, but as a living god whose desires automatically became moral imperatives that the world was obligated to satisfy. This transformation would prove to be Rome's greatest nightmare, and history's most terrifying example of what happened when unlimited power was placed in the hands of someone who had been systematically trained to use it without mercy, restraint, or conscience. Chapter 6. The mask falls away, ascending to absolute power. The news arrived at Capri with the speed of a lightning bolt, carried by a breathless messenger whose face bore the unmistakable expression of someone who had witnessed the hand of fate reshaping the world in a single, terrible moment. Tiberius was dead, found in his bedchamber under circumstances that would be carefully obscured by official reports, but whispered about in terrified voices for generations to come. The aging emperor, who had ruled through fear and paranoia for over 2 decades, had finally succumbed to forces that even his legendary cunning could not overcome. For 25-year-old Caligula, standing beside his great-uncle's corpse in the flickering lamplight of that cursed chamber, the moment represented the culmination of years of patient preparation and careful planning. The education he had received in the darkest arts of absolute power was about to be put to its ultimate test, as he prepared to claim an inheritance that would give him dominion over the greatest empire the world had ever known. The official version of Tiberius's death would speak of natural causes, a peaceful passing that reflected the dignified conclusion of a long and successful reign. But those who had witnessed the emperor's final hours knew that his demise had been neither natural nor peaceful. The convulsions that had racked his wasted frame, the terror that had blazed in his eyes as life departed, the suspicious marks that marred his throat, all spoke to a more violent conclusion than the sanitized accounts would ever admit. Caligula himself maintained a perfect mask of grief and shock as news of the death spread throughout the villa, playing the role of a devastated heir who had lost not just an emperor, but a beloved mentor and guide. His performance was flawless, calibrated to convince observers that his tears were genuine while concealing the cold satisfaction that burned behind his dark eyes like banked coals waiting to burst into flame. The political machinery that would elevate him to the purple had been set in motion years earlier through Tiberius's own paranoid purges of potential rivals and alternative heirs. The emperor's systematic elimination of anyone who might have challenged Caligula's succession had cleared a path to power that was now virtually unobstructed. The Senate, decimated by decades of judicial murders and intimidation, lacked both the courage and the capability to oppose his accession. The Praetorian Guard, whose loyalty could be purchased with sufficient gold and promises of continued privilege, saw him as their best hope for maintaining their own positions in the new regime. But Caligula understood that claiming power and wielding it effectively were entirely different challenges requiring different skill sets and psychological approaches. The lessons he had learned during his years on Capri had prepared him for the technical aspects of tyranny, but the transition from student to master would require him to synthesize those lessons into a coherent system of governance that could maintain control over an empire populated by millions of subjects whose compliance could not be taken for granted. The journey from Capri to Rome provided him with crucial time to finalize his plans and prepare for the performance of his lifetime. The young man who had spent years perfecting his ability to manipulate individual psychology now faced the challenge of managing the expectations and emotions of an entire population that had been eagerly awaiting deliverance from Tiberius's oppressive reign. Intelligence reports that reached him during the voyage painted a picture of an empire desperate for change and renewal. The citizenry, exhausted by decades of fear and uncertainty, was prepared to embrace almost any alternative to the paranoid tyranny that had characterized the later years of Tiberius's rule. They wanted a young, energetic emperor who would restore the glory and prosperity that they remembered from the reign of Augustus. They were eager to believe that Caligula represented a return to the golden age of imperial benevolence and competent governance. This widespread optimism provided Caligula with a unique opportunity to establish his authority while maintaining the illusion of popular legitimacy. He could implement the most extreme measures of political control while presenting them as necessary reforms, designed to protect the people from the chaos and corruption that had supposedly characterized the previous administration. The very enthusiasm with which his subjects anticipated his reign would make them complicit in their own subjugation, as they convinced themselves that his increasingly authoritarian measures were evidence of his commitment to effective governance. The elaborate ceremonies that marked his formal accession to power demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of political theatre and its uses in shaping public opinion. Rather than simply claiming the imperial titles through legal or military mechanisms, he orchestrated a series of public spectacles that transformed his elevation into a religious experience for participants and observers alike. The Senate, grateful to have survived the transition and eager to curry favour with their new master, competed to offer increasingly extravagant praise and unprecedented honours. They granted him titles and privileges that exceeded even those claimed by Augustus, while simultaneously convincing themselves that their flattery was evidence of their wisdom rather than their cowardice. The elaborate speeches and ceremonial gestures that marked these proceedings created an atmosphere where genuine political discourse became impossible, replaced by ritualistic affirmations of imperial divinity that brooked no dissent or questioning. Caligula's initial public appearances as emperor were carefully choreographed to reinforce the impression of dramatic change, while gradually introducing elements that would later serve as justification for more extreme measures. He presented himself as a reformer committed to undoing the damage caused by his predecessor's paranoid policies, announcing amnesty for political prisoners and promising to restore the dignity and authority of traditional Roman institutions. But even these apparently benevolent gestures contained subtle indications of the iron fist that lay hidden beneath the velvet glove. The pardons he granted were carefully selective, designed to reward potential allies while demonstrating his power over life and death, rather than establishing any genuine commitment to justice or mercy. The restoration of institutional dignity was accompanied by new procedures that actually concentrated more authority in imperial hands, while creating the illusion of increased autonomy for senatorial and judicial bodies. Most importantly, his early proclamations established precedents for interpreting imperial authority that would later justify the most extreme exercises of tyrannical power. He claimed the right to speak for the gods themselves in matters of religious doctrine, presented his personal preferences as divine mandates that possessed the force of law, and suggested that opposition to his policies constituted not just political disagreement, but blasphemous rebellion against the natural order of the universe. The Praetorian Guard, whose support was essential for maintaining power in a system where military force ultimately determined political outcomes, received particular attention during these crucial early months. Caligula understood that their loyalty could not be purchased through material rewards alone. It required the creation of psychological bonds that would make betrayal literally unthinkable for individual guardsmen who might be tempted by alternative sources of patronage and protection. He achieved this psychological capture through a combination of elaborate ceremonies that emphasized their special relationship with the emperor, material privileges that separated them from ordinary citizens and even regular legionary soldiers, and carefully staged demonstrations of imperial power that reminded them of the consequences that awaited anyone who chose the losing side in political conflicts. Most effectively, he made them complicit in his crimes by involving them directly in the implementation of his most extreme policies, creating shared guilt that bound them to his fate regardless of their personal feelings about his methods. The broader population of Rome required different but equally sophisticated techniques for maintaining their compliance and enthusiasm. Caligula launched an unprecedented program of public entertainment and spectacle that provided citizens with distractions from political concerns, while simultaneously demonstrating the scope of imperial resources and the emperor's commitment to their happiness and welfare. The gladiatorial games and chariot races that he sponsored exceeded anything previously attempted in their scale and extravagance, featuring exotic animals imported from the farthest reaches of the empire, elaborate stage sets that transformed the arena into fantastical landscapes, and celebrity performers whose fame spread throughout the Mediterranean world. These spectacles served multiple functions simultaneously. They provided genuine entertainment for the masses, demonstrated imperial wealth and power to potential enemies, and created psychological associations between the emperor's person and the pleasure and excitement that citizens experienced during these events. But perhaps most importantly, they established precedents for the kind of theatrical excess that would later characterize his most extreme demonstrations of divine authority. Citizens who had cheered enthusiastically for increasingly elaborate and expensive entertainments could hardly object when those same resources were redirected toward projects that served the emperor's personal glorification rather than their own amusement. The economic policies implemented during his early reign revealed sophisticated understanding of how material prosperity could be used to purchase political compliance, while simultaneously concentrating wealth and power in imperial hands. He launched massive public works projects that provided employment for thousands of citizens, while creating monuments to his own greatness that would remind future generations of his divine authority. The funding for these projects came from innovative taxation schemes that extracted unprecedented resources from the empire's wealthy classes, while maintaining the illusion that the burden was being shared equitably among all citizens. Provincial governors found themselves subject to increasingly arbitrary demands for tribute and voluntary contributions, while wealthy Romans discovered that their continued prosperity depended entirely on maintaining imperial favour through ever larger displays of loyalty and generosity. These financial manipulations served multiple purposes beyond simply funding imperial projects. They systematically transferred wealth from potential sources of opposition to the imperial treasury, reducing the resources that enemies might use to fund resistance, while increasing the emperor's capacity to reward supporters and finance military operations. Equally importantly, they established precedents for treating private property as ultimately subject to imperial authority, laying the groundwork for the kind of arbitrary confiscations that would later become routine tools of political control. The religious innovations that marked his early reign provided perhaps the clearest indication of the direction his rule would ultimately take, though their full implications would not become apparent until much later. He began making subtle modifications to traditional ceremonies and rituals, introducing elements that emphasized his personal connection to the divine, while gradually eroding the distinction between emperor worship and the veneration of traditional Roman gods. These changes were implemented gradually and presented as attempts to restore ancient customs rather than revolutionary innovations. He claimed to be uncovering forgotten rituals that had been practiced by the earliest Roman kings, discovering lost texts that revealed the true nature of imperial authority, reviving ceremonies that would strengthen the empire's connection to the gods who had granted it dominion over the world. But careful analysis of these supposedly ancient traditions revealed that they were actually sophisticated theological innovations designed to establish Caligula's divinity as a present reality, rather than a future possibility dependent on Senate approval after his death. He was systematically transforming the emperor cult from a posthumous honour into a living religion that demanded immediate worship and absolute obedience from all subjects. As his first year as emperor drew to a close, Caligula had successfully established himself as the undisputed master of the Roman world while maintaining the appearance of popular legitimacy and traditional governance. The elaborate mask he had constructed concealed the true nature of his intentions from all but the most perceptive observers, who had begun to notice troubling patterns in his behaviour that suggested darker developments might be forthcoming. The stage was set for the next phase of his reign, when the careful restraints he had maintained during his period of consolidation would gradually be abandoned in favour of increasingly open displays of the absolute power he had always intended to wield. The Roman people, who had celebrated his accession with such enthusiasm, were about to discover what kind of monster they had placed on the throne of the world. The mask was beginning to slip, and behind it lay horrors that would redefine the very concept of tyranny for all future ages. Chapter 7. The Gods Must Be Crazy. Divine madness takes hold. The transformation began on a night when the very stars seemed to writhe in their celestial spheres, as if the heavens themselves recoiled from witnessing what was about to unfold in the marble corridors of the imperial palace. Caligula had ruled for 18 months with the careful restraint of a predator biding its time, but the mask of reasonable governance was finally beginning to crack under the pressure of impulses that could no longer be contained within the bounds of conventional tyranny. The incident that would later be remembered as the first clear sign of his descent into divine madness involved a senator named Marcus Junius Silanus, whose only crime was possessing a bloodline that traced back to Augustus through his daughter Julia. During a routine audience, Caligula had listened with apparent patience as Silanus presented a petition regarding tax assessments in his home province, nodding thoughtfully at the reasonable arguments and even asking clarifying questions that suggested genuine interest in administrative efficiency. But those who knew how to read the subtle signs of imperial displeasure noticed the almost imperceptible tightening around the emperor's eyes, the way his fingers drummed silently against the arm of his throne, the barely audible intake of breath that preceded moments of explosive violence. When Silanus concluded his presentation and waited respectfully for a response, Caligula rose from his seat with fluid grace and walked slowly around the kneeling senator, studying him with the focused attention of a connoisseur examining a particularly interesting specimen. "Tell me, Marcus Junius Silanus," the emperor said in a voice so soft that everyone present had to strain to hear his words, "do you ever dream of wearing purple?" The question hung in the air like incense smoke, seemingly innocent but carrying undertones that made experienced courtiers exchange nervous glances. Silanus, genuinely confused by the inquiry, responded with the kind of honest bewilderment that would have been endearing in any other context, but proved fatal in the presence of an emperor who had begun to see potential threats in every shadow. What followed was not an execution, but an artistic performance that revealed the true scope of Caligula's imagination when it came to inflicting suffering. Rather than simply ordering Silanus's death, he decreed that the senator would be transformed into a living example of what happened to those who harboured treasonous ambitions. The process took 3 days to complete and involved techniques that pushed the boundaries of human endurance while ensuring that the victim remained conscious and aware throughout the entire ordeal. The details of Silanus's destruction were carefully recorded by imperial scribes and distributed throughout the empire as both entertainment and education. Citizens in distant provinces could read detailed accounts of how the emperor had systematically stripped away not just the senator's wealth and status, but his very identity as a human being. By the time Caligula finished with him, Silanus had been reduced to a gibbering creature that could barely remember its own name, much less harbour any ambitions that might threaten imperial authority. But the most chilling aspect of the entire episode was not the cruelty itself, but the obvious pleasure that Caligula derived from the process. Witnesses reported that he had never appeared more relaxed or content than during those 3 days of systematic torture, humming quietly to himself as he supervised each phase of the senator's degradation. He treated the entire affair as a form of artistic expression, constantly making minor adjustments to maximise both the victim's suffering and the educational value of the spectacle for other potential dissidents. The psychological impact of this demonstration extended far beyond its immediate victim. Senators who had previously felt secure in their traditional privileges suddenly found themselves re-evaluating every word they spoke, every gesture they made, every thought they allowed to cross their minds in the emperor's presence. The realization that their survival depended not on law or custom, but on the unpredictable whims of someone who might decide to destroy them for purely artistic reasons, created an atmosphere of terror that paralysed effective governance while concentrating unprecedented power in imperial hands. Caligula's sister Drusilla watched these proceedings with the same intense fascination that characterised all of her interactions with her brother's exercises in absolute authority. Now 23 years old, and possessed of a beauty that poets struggle to describe without lapsing into blasphemy, she had become his closest advisor and most enthusiastic collaborator in the increasingly elaborate schemes that occupied his attention. Their relationship had evolved far beyond the intense sibling bond that had sustained them through the dangerous uncertainties of their youth. Palace servants sworn to silence under penalty of death whispered about encounters they had witnessed that left no doubt about the physical nature of their connection. But even more disturbing than their carnal relationship was the intellectual and emotional symbiosis that allowed them to communicate complex ideas through glances and gestures that excluded everyone else from their private world. Drusilla had developed her own reputation for creative cruelty that complemented and enhanced her brother's artistic vision. While Caligula focused on the grand gestures and theatrical spectacles that demonstrated imperial power to mass audiences, she specialised in the intimate psychological manipulations that could transform individual enemies into willing collaborators in their own destruction. Together, they formed a partnership that multiplied the effectiveness of their separate talents, while creating new possibilities for tyrannical excess that neither could have achieved alone. The religious innovations that had begun as subtle modifications to traditional ceremonies accelerated during this period into open claims of divine status that challenged every assumption about the relationship between mortal rulers and immortal gods. Caligula announced that he had received direct communications from Jupiter himself, who had revealed that the emperor was actually his son rather than merely his earthly representative. These divine revelations were supported by elaborate theological arguments that drew on genuine scholarship while reaching conclusions that would have been considered blasphemous in any previous era. Teams of carefully selected priests and philosophers worked around the clock to develop doctrinal frameworks that could justify the emperor's claims while providing intellectual cover for citizens who might have moral qualms about worshipping a living human being. The practical implications of imperial divinity were implemented through increasingly invasive requirements for religious observance that transformed every aspect of daily life into opportunities for demonstrating loyalty or disloyalty to the new order. Citizens found themselves required to participate in ceremonies that explicitly acknowledged Caligula's godhood, to display images of the emperor in their homes and businesses, to modify their speech patterns to avoid words that might be construed as insufficiently reverent toward divine authority. These requirements created a comprehensive surveillance system that operated through voluntary compliance rather than external coercion. Citizens who failed to demonstrate appropriate enthusiasm for emperor worship automatically identified themselves as potential dissidents, while those who embraced the new religious requirements with genuine fervour earned imperial favour and protection. The system was self-enforcing and nearly impossible to resist without revealing oneself as an enemy of the state. The economic policies that had initially appeared focused on funding public works and entertainment revealed their true purpose as tools for systematically transferring wealth from private hands to imperial control. The taxation schemes that had seemed innovative became increasingly arbitrary and confiscatory, while the public works projects evolved into monuments to imperial divinity that consumed resources on an unprecedented scale. The most ambitious of these projects was the construction of a massive temple complex that would serve as the primary centre for emperor worship throughout the empire. The design called for a structure that would dwarf even the greatest temples of the traditional gods, featuring innovative architectural elements that had never been attempted in previous construction projects. The cost was astronomical, requiring the confiscation of entire estates and the implementation of new taxes that pushed even wealthy citizens to the brink of financial ruin. But Caligula insisted that such sacrifices were not only appropriate but necessary for a project that would demonstrate Roman superiority to future generations, while providing a suitable venue for the worship he deserved as a living god. Citizens who complained about the financial burden were reminded that their resources had always belonged ultimately to the emperor, and that their previous prosperity had been permitted rather than earned through their own efforts. The military policies implemented during this period reflected Caligula's growing confidence in his ability to reshape reality through the application of divine will. Rather than focusing on traditional strategic objectives like defending borders or conquering new territories, he launched campaigns that were designed primarily to demonstrate his supernatural authority over the natural world itself. The most notorious of these expeditions involved an elaborate invasion of Britain that was cancelled at the last moment when Caligula declared that Neptune had advised him to collect seashells as tribute instead of engaging in conventional military operations. The legions that had been assembled for this campaign found themselves spending weeks gathering shells and pebbles from beaches while their commander proclaimed victory over the ocean itself. This episode, which would have been treated as evidence of insanity in any other ruler, was presented as proof of Caligula's unique ability to communicate directly with the gods and to achieve diplomatic solutions that mere mortals could never have conceived. The soldiers involved were required to participate in elaborate ceremonies celebrating their emperor's triumph over divine forces, while the collected shells were transported to Rome with the same pomp and ceremony, typically reserved for captured enemy standards. The judicial system that had traditionally provided some protection for citizens against arbitrary imperial authority was systematically transformed into an instrument of entertainment and social control. Trials became theatrical performances where the outcome was predetermined, but the process was designed to maximize both the educational value for observers and the artistic satisfaction that Caligula derived from watching his enemies destroy themselves through their own testimony. The most elaborate of these judicial spectacles involved a group of senators who had been accused of participating in a conspiracy that existed only in the emperor's imagination. Rather than simply executing them or forcing them into exile, Caligula orchestrated a series of trials that lasted for months and featured increasingly absurd charges that forced the defendants to argue against allegations that became more fantastical with each passing day. By the time the proceedings concluded, the accused had been compelled to confess not just to reasonable crimes like treason or corruption, but to impossible offences like consorting with foreign demons, practicing magic spells designed to kill the emperor through supernatural means, and plotting to replace Jupiter himself with alternative deities who would be more sympathetic to Republican government. The confessions were extracted through techniques that left no physical evidence of coercion, creating legal precedents that could be applied to future cases involving anyone who might oppose imperial policies. The transformation of Roman entertainment reflected Caligula's understanding that popular compliance could be maintained through spectacles that combined genuine pleasure with subtle indoctrination in the new religious and political orthodoxy. The gladiatorial games that had traditionally featured straightforward combat between professional fighters evolved into elaborate morality plays where the participants represented various theological and political concepts rather than simply competing for victory. These productions required months of preparation and featured scripts that had been carefully crafted to reinforce specific messages about imperial divinity, the futility of opposition to divine authority, and the benefits that loyal citizens could expect to receive from their god-emperor's benevolent rule. The audiences that attended these events found themselves participating in religious ceremonies disguised as entertainment, cheering for outcomes that had been predetermined to support imperial propaganda while believing they were simply enjoying traditional Roman pleasures. The most ambitious of these productions featured Caligula himself as the central character, appearing in the arena dressed as various gods and heroes from classical mythology. These performances allowed him to demonstrate his divine nature through carefully choreographed displays of supernatural authority, defeating opponents who had been selected and trained to lose in ways that would maximize the dramatic impact of his inevitable victories. The psychological impact of watching their emperor perform as a living god in the same venue where they had previously enjoyed entertainment created powerful associations that made resistance to his religious claims psychologically difficult for even skeptical citizens. The combination of spectacle, religious ritual, and imperial propaganda proved devastatingly effective in reshaping public consciousness, according to Caligula's specifications. As his third year as emperor began, Caligula had successfully transformed the Roman Empire into a theocracy centered on his own divine person. The careful restraints that had characterized his early reign had been systematically abandoned in favour of increasingly open displays of absolute power that acknowledged no limitations from law, tradition, or conventional morality. But even these unprecedented exercises in tyrannical excess were merely preparation for the ultimate expression of his divine authority, the formal elevation of his sister Drusilla from imperial family member to goddess and consort. This final transgression would push the boundaries of acceptable behaviour beyond anything the ancient world had previously witnessed, creating scandals that would echo through history while demonstrating that no human institution or moral principle could constrain someone who possessed the will and the power to remake reality according to his own desires. The stage was set for the most shocking chapter in a reign that had already redefined the very concept of imperial excess, and Rome was about to discover that its emperor's capacity for evil had only begun to reveal itself. Chapter 8. Sacred Flesh. Profane Love, the Goddess Drusilla. The announcement came on the Ides of September, delivered with the same ceremonial gravity typically reserved for declarations of war or the founding of new provinces. Standing before the assembled Senate in the full regalia of Pontifex Maximus, Caligula proclaimed that the gods had revealed to him a truth so profound that it would reshape the very foundations of Roman civilization. His sister Drusilla was to be recognized not merely as a member of the imperial family, but as a living goddess whose divine nature demanded appropriate worship and reverence from all loyal citizens. The senators who heard this proclamation struggled to maintain their composure, as the full implications of the emperor's words penetrated their consciousness. This was not simply another example of imperial excess or family favoritism, it was a fundamental challenge to every moral, religious and social principle that had guided Roman society for nearly a millennium. The emperor was not just claiming divine status for himself, but extending that divinity to justify a relationship that violated the most basic taboos of civilized behaviour. Drusilla herself stood beside her brother during this historic moment, her beauty enhanced by ceremonial robes that had been specifically designed to emphasize her newfound divine status. At 24, she had reached the full flowering of her physical perfection, but it was the intelligence that blazed behind her dark eyes that truly distinguished her from the merely beautiful women who populated the imperial court. She possessed the same predatory charisma that made Caligula so effective at manipulating others, combined with a subtle understanding of human psychology that allowed her to anticipate and exploit weaknesses that her brother might overlook. The theological framework that supported Drusilla's elevation had been carefully constructed over months of intensive scholarly effort by the empire's most accomplished religious experts. Drawing on precedents from Egyptian and Eastern traditions where divine rulers regularly married their sisters to preserve sacred bloodlines, the imperial theologians argued that Roman religious law had been incomplete in its understanding of how divinity actually functioned in the mortal world. According to their new doctrines, the gods had always intended for divine rulers to form sacred partnerships with family members who shared their supernatural essence. The traditional Roman prohibition against incestuous relationships applied only to ordinary mortals who lacked the divine nature that transformed such unions from sinful transgressions into holy sacraments. Caligula and Drusilla were not violating natural law, but fulfilling their divine destiny by consummating a relationship that had been ordained by the gods themselves. These arguments were supported by elaborate ceremonies that transformed their private relationship into a public religious observance that demanded participation from the entire imperial court. Palace servants found themselves required to acknowledge Drusilla's divine status through daily rituals that involved offerings, prayers, and formal requests for her blessing on their activities. Failure to demonstrate appropriate reverence was treated not as simple discourtesy, but as blasphemy that could result in immediate execution. The practical implications of Drusilla's new status extended far beyond ceremonial requirements into every aspect of imperial governance. She was granted formal authority over religious policy throughout the empire with the power to modify traditional rituals, establish new theological doctrines, and punish citizens whose devotion to the imperial cult was deemed insufficient. This authority was exercised with the same creative cruelty that characterized all of her brother's innovations, but with an added dimension of sexual sadism that reflected her unique perspective on the uses of absolute power. Her first major exercise of divine authority involved the systematic purge of priests and priestesses who had expressed even mild reservations about the theological innovations that supported her elevation. Rather than simply removing these individuals from their positions, she orchestrated elaborate public ceremonies where they were forced to recant their previous beliefs while participating in rituals that violated every principle they had previously held sacred. The most notorious of these ceremonies involved the High Priestess of Vesta, whose vows of chastity had made her the symbolic embodiment of Roman virtue for over 30 years. Drusilla decreed that this woman's resistance to acknowledging imperial divinity proved that her supposed purity had actually been a form of spiritual corruption that needed to be cleansed through appropriate divine intervention. The ritual that followed lasted for 7 days and nights, during which the former priestess was subjected to experiences that systematically destroyed not just her physical integrity, but her psychological identity as a servant of the traditional gods. By the time the ceremony concluded, she had been transformed into an enthusiastic advocate for the new religious order, publicly proclaiming that her previous devotion to Vesta had been based on ignorance of the superior divinity represented by Caligula and Drusilla. The psychological techniques that Drusilla employed during these purges revealed a sophisticated understanding of how religious conviction could be systematically undermined and replaced with alternative belief systems. She recognized that simply forcing compliance through terror was less effective than creating genuine conversion experiences that made her victims active collaborators in promoting the new orthodoxy. Her methods involved carefully calibrated combinations of physical pleasure and pain, designed to create powerful associations between submission to imperial authority and personal gratification. Victims who initially resisted found themselves experiencing sensations that their own bodies interpreted as rewards for compliance, creating internal conflicts that gradually eroded their ability to maintain coherent opposition to her demands. The relationship between the divine siblings became a central focus of imperial propaganda, celebrated through art, literature, and public ceremonies that portrayed their union as the perfect expression of divine love made manifest in the mortal world. Poets competed to create increasingly elaborate verses praising the beauty and significance of their sacred partnership, while artists produced sculptures and paintings that depicted them in poses inspired by classical representations of gods and goddesses. But these public celebrations of their relationship served purposes that went far beyond simple artistic expression or religious worship. By forcing citizens to participate in ceremonies that explicitly celebrated incest as a divine virtue, Caligula was systematically breaking down the moral frameworks that might otherwise constrain imperial authority. People who could be compelled to praise as sacred what they had previously considered abominable could be convinced to accept virtually any imperial policy, no matter how extreme or unreasonable. The economic implications of Drusilla's elevation reflected the siblings' understanding that religious authority could be converted into material wealth through carefully structured systems of tribute and taxation. Citizens throughout the empire found themselves required to contribute to elaborate temples and ceremonial complexes dedicated to the divine couple, while wealthy individuals competed to demonstrate their loyalty through increasingly extravagant displays of generosity toward imperial projects. The most ambitious of these construction projects involved the creation of a massive palace complex that would serve as both residence and temple for the divine siblings. The design incorporated architectural elements from Egyptian, Persian, and Eastern traditions, creating a unique synthesis that reflected their claim to authority over not just Roman territories, but all civilized peoples throughout the known world. The cost of this project exceeded the annual revenues of entire provinces, requiring the implementation of new taxation systems that pushed the empire's financial resources to their absolute limits. But Caligula insisted that such expenditures were not merely justified, but necessary for maintaining the divine favour that protected Roman civilization from the chaos that would inevitably result from inadequate reverence toward their god-emperors. The military implications of the imperial siblings' relationship reflected their recognition that divine authority needed to be supported by earthly force, capable of suppressing any resistance that might emerge from traditional religious or moral constituencies. They systematically replaced senior military commanders with officers who had demonstrated absolute loyalty to the new religious order, while implementing new oath requirements that bound soldiers not just to the emperor, but to the divine couple as manifestations of supreme celestial authority. These military reforms were accompanied by elaborate ceremonies that transformed routine administrative functions into religious rituals designed to reinforce the soldiers' psychological commitment to imperial divinity. Regular training exercises became opportunities for demonstrating devotion to Caligula and Drusilla through increasingly extreme displays of obedience that pushed the boundaries of human endurance while creating shared experiences that bonded participants to the imperial cause. The most notorious of these military ceremonies involved mock battles where soldiers were required to fight against representations of traditional Roman virtues, defeating symbolic enemies that represented concepts like republican government, senatorial authority, and conventional moral restraints. These exercises served multiple functions simultaneously, providing practical training in combat techniques, while indoctrinating participants in the ideological frameworks that supported absolute imperial authority. The international implications of the divine siblings' relationship created diplomatic challenges that reflected the unprecedented nature of their claims to supernatural authority. Foreign rulers who had previously maintained cordial relationships with Rome found themselves confronted with demands for recognition of Caligula and Drusilla's divine status that went far beyond traditional diplomatic courtesy. Ambassadors from client kingdoms were required to participate in elaborate ceremonies acknowledging imperial divinity before being permitted to conduct any official business, while tribute payments were restructured to emphasize their religious significance as offerings to living gods, rather than simple political obligations to an earthly emperor. These requirements created tensions that strained relationships with allies, while providing justification for military actions against rulers who refused to acknowledge the new religious order. The most dramatic of these diplomatic confrontations involved the Jewish population of Alexandria, whose religious convictions prevented them from participating in ceremonies that violated their fundamental theological principles. Rather than negotiating accommodations that might have preserved civic peace, Drusilla insisted that their resistance constituted blasphemy that demanded systematic punishment designed to serve as an example for other potentially recalcitrant religious minorities throughout the empire. The persecution that followed revealed the full scope of the divine siblings' capacity for creative cruelty when dealing with populations that could not be converted through conventional techniques of persuasion and intimidation. The methods employed went beyond simple violence to include psychological tortures specifically designed to force victims to violate their own religious principles while acknowledging the superior authority of the imperial gods. As the second year of Drusilla's divinity began, the transformation of Roman society had proceeded so far that citizens who remembered the traditional moral and religious frameworks found themselves isolated minorities in an empire that had been systematically restructured according to the divine siblings' specifications. The institutions that had once provided stability and continuity had been replaced by systems that existed primarily to serve imperial pleasure and demonstrate divine authority. But even these unprecedented achievements in the systematic corruption of an entire civilization were merely preparation for the ultimate expression of divine love that would scandalize the ancient world and create legends that would persist for millennia. The formal marriage ceremony that would unite Caligula and Drusilla not just as lovers, but as husband and wife would represent the final transgression that pushed Roman society beyond any possibility of return to conventional moral frameworks. The preparations for this sacred union were already underway, involving theological innovations, architectural projects, and ceremonial preparations that would transform their private relationship into a public sacrament that would redefine the very nature of divine authority in the mortal world. Rome was about to witness the ultimate expression of absolute power, unconstrained by any human limitation or moral consideration, and the empire would never be the same. Chapter 9. The Marriage of Gods. When Heaven Fell to Earth. The preparations began at dawn on the first day of spring, when teams of slaves began adorning the imperial palace with flowers that had been imported from the farthest reaches of the empire at costs that exceeded the annual budgets of entire cities. But these were no ordinary wedding preparations. They were the opening ceremonies for an event that would fundamentally reshape the relationship between divine and mortal authority in ways that would echo through the corridors of history for centuries to come. Caligula had decreed that his marriage to Drusilla would not be a simple dynastic union, or even a conventional religious ceremony, but rather the earthly manifestation of a cosmic event that had been ordained by the gods themselves since the beginning of time. According to the theological framework that had been carefully constructed to support this unprecedented transgression, their union represented the restoration of a divine partnership that had been temporarily separated by the limitations of mortal incarnation, but was now ready to resume its proper form. The ceremony itself was scheduled to last for 7 days and nights, incorporating ritual elements from every major religious tradition represented within the empire, while adding new components that had been specifically designed to emphasize the unique nature of divine marriage, as opposed to the crude approximations that characterized unions between ordinary mortals. Each day would focus on different aspects of their relationship, building toward a climactic moment that would formally establish them as the supreme divine couple whose authority superseded all earthly law and conventional morality. Drusilla's preparation for the ceremony revealed the meticulous attention to detail that characterized all of her brother's most ambitious projects. Teams of skilled craftsmen had spent months creating ceremonial garments that incorporated precious materials and artistic techniques that pushed the boundaries of what was technically possible using available resources. Her wedding dress was woven from silk that had been dyed with pigments, extracted from rare deep-sea creatures, creating colours that seemed to shift and change depending on the angle of observation. But it was not just the external magnificence of her appearance that had been carefully orchestrated. Her psychological preparation for the role of divine bride had involved months of intensive training in the theological and philosophical concepts that would justify their union to skeptical observers. She had been coached by the Empire's most skilled rhetoricians in the art of presenting incestuous marriage as not just acceptable, but sacred, learning to articulate arguments that could transform moral revulsion into religious enthusiasm. The guest list for the ceremony included representatives from every significant political, military and religious institution throughout the Roman world, ensuring that the marriage would be witnessed by individuals whose subsequent testimony could establish its legitimacy, according to both divine and human law. But these were not merely passive observers. Each guest was assigned specific roles in the ceremonial proceedings that would make them active participants in legitimizing what conventional morality would have condemned as abominable. Senators who had spent their careers defending traditional Roman values found themselves required to deliver speeches praising the theological sophistication of imperial theology and the benefits that divine marriage would provide for the empire's continued prosperity. Military commanders were assigned roles that involved swearing sacred oaths to defend the divine couple against all earthly enemies, while acknowledging that their own authority derived entirely from imperial divinity. Most disturbingly, religious officials from various traditions were compelled to participate in ceremonies that explicitly contradicted their previous theological commitments, while proclaiming that the imperial marriage represented a higher form of spiritual truth than anything contained in their traditional doctrines. These forced conversions created a comprehensive system of complicity that made future resistance psychologically difficult for individuals who had publicly abandoned their previous moral frameworks. The first day of ceremonies focused on purification rituals designed to prepare both bride and groom for their transformation from mortals who happened to possess divine nature into full gods whose earthly existence would serve as a permanent bridge between celestial and terrestrial realms. These rituals incorporated elements from mystery religions that had traditionally been practiced only by small groups of initiates, but were now being performed before massive audiences as demonstrations of imperial authority over all forms of spiritual knowledge. Caligula and Drusilla were bathed in water that had been collected from sacred springs throughout the empire, anointed with oils that contained ingredients believed to possess supernatural properties, and dressed in ceremonial garments that incorporated symbols representing their authority over various aspects of divine power. But the most significant element of these purification ceremonies involved the systematic renunciation of any remaining connections to ordinary human identity or moral constraint. Standing before altars that featured representations of traditional Roman gods who were now acknowledged as their divine subordinates, the imperial siblings formally declared their independence from every law, custom, and ethical principle that had previously governed human behaviour. They proclaimed that their marriage would establish new standards for divine conduct that superseded all previous moral frameworks, while creating precedents that would guide the behaviour of future god-emperors. The second day featured elaborate theological discussions where teams of carefully selected scholars presented academic arguments supporting the divine marriage, while refuting objections that might be raised by less enlightened observers. These presentations were not simply intellectual exercises, but carefully orchestrated propaganda events designed to provide rational justifications for what emotional responses might reject as intuitively wrong. The scholars who participated in these sessions had been selected not just for their expertise in religious law, but for their demonstrated willingness to subordinate scholarly integrity to imperial requirements. They presented papers that drew on genuine academic research while reaching conclusions that served political rather than intellectual purposes, creating an appearance of objective scholarly consensus that could be cited by future imperial propagandists. The arguments they advanced incorporated sophisticated theological concepts that had been borrowed from various philosophical traditions but synthesized in ways that created entirely new doctrinal frameworks. They argued that conventional moral prohibitions against incest reflected limited human understanding of divine nature, while the marriage of gods operated according to different principles that transcended ordinary ethical categories. Most persuasively, they contended that the empire's continued prosperity and military success proved that the gods approved of imperial policies, including theological innovations that challenged traditional moral assumptions. This argument from consequences provided a practical justification that could appeal to citizens whose primary concern was maintaining stability and prosperity rather than preserving abstract moral principles. The third day involved ceremonies that formally established Drusilla's authority over various aspects of imperial governance, transforming her from divine consort into co-ruler with executive powers that matched her brothers in scope and legitimacy. These ceremonies were designed to demonstrate that divine marriage created not just personal union but political partnership that enhanced the effectiveness of imperial administration while maintaining unity of command. She was granted formal titles that acknowledged her authority over religious policy, judicial administration, and military command, with elaborate rituals that transferred actual governmental powers rather than simply creating ceremonial honours. Provincial governors were required to swear oaths of loyalty to her personally, while military commanders received new commissions that acknowledged her divine authority over their troops. These transfers of power were accompanied by demonstrations of her capacity to exercise imperial authority with the same creative effectiveness that had characterized her brother's innovations. She issued edicts that modified existing laws, appointed new officials to key administrative positions, and announced policy changes that would affect millions of citizens throughout the empire. Most significantly, she established new legal frameworks that formalized the theological principles underlying divine marriage, creating precedents that could be applied to future imperial relationships while protecting their union against potential legal challenges. These innovations transformed what might have been viewed as personal moral failures into officially sanctioned expressions of divine authority. The fourth day featured massive public celebrations that demonstrated popular support for the divine marriage, while providing opportunities for citizens to participate directly in legitimizing the imperial union. These celebrations were not voluntary expressions of enthusiasm, but carefully orchestrated events where participation was required and non-participation was interpreted as evidence of disloyalty to the imperial regime. Citizens throughout Rome were required to attend ceremonial events in their neighbourhoods, where they publicly acknowledged the theological legitimacy of divine marriage, while requesting blessings from the imperial couple for their own families and businesses. These neighbourhood ceremonies were coordinated to create a synchronised expression of popular approval that could be cited as evidence of widespread enthusiasm for imperial innovations. The celebrations also featured elaborate entertainments that incorporated the imperial marriage into popular culture through gladiatorial contests, theatrical performances, and artistic displays that portrayed the union as the climactic moment in Roman history, toward which all previous events had been leading. These cultural productions served to normalize incestuous marriage by presenting it as not just acceptable, but admirable behavior that represented the highest expression of divine love. The fifth day involved the formal exchange of vows between Caligula and Drusilla, conducted according to rituals that had been specifically designed to emphasize the cosmic significance of their union while establishing legal precedents that could govern future divine marriages. The ceremony was conducted by the Pontifex Maximus, a role that Caligula filled himself, demonstrating his authority over religious law as well as civil administration. The vows they exchanged went far beyond conventional marriage promises to include mutual commitments to exercise divine authority and partnership while maintaining the theological principles that justified their union. They pledged to govern the empire as manifestations of celestial will, to eliminate opposition to divine authority through whatever means proved necessary, and to serve as living examples of how gods conducted themselves when incarnated in mortal form. But the most significant aspect of their vows involved explicit commitments to transcend all conventional moral limitations while establishing new standards for divine behaviour that would guide future imperial couples. They formally renounced any remaining obligations to human law or custom, declaring their independence from every ethical framework except those they chose to create through their own divine will. The sixth day featured ceremonies that consummated their marriage before massive audiences who served as witnesses to the physical union of living gods. These ceremonies pushed the boundaries of public decency far beyond anything previously attempted in Roman society, transforming what should have been private intimacy into public religious ritual that demanded enthusiastic participation from observers. The theological framework that supported these public demonstrations of divine sexuality drew on fertility religions from various traditions, while arguing that the creative power of divine union needed to be witnessed by mortal subjects in order to transfer its benefits to the broader empire. The imperial couple's physical relationship was presented not as personal gratification, but as religious duty that served the spiritual needs of their subjects. Citizens who attended these ceremonies were required to participate actively in celebrating the divine union through chants, prayers, and ritual gestures that made them complicit in legitimizing behavior that conventional morality would have condemned as scandalous exhibitionism. These requirements created powerful psychological pressures that made subsequent resistance to imperial authority emotionally difficult for individuals who had publicly participated in celebrating what they privately considered abominable. The seventh and final day involved ceremonies that formally established the divine marriage as a permanent institution that would continue to influence imperial governance and religious policy for future generations. These ceremonies created legal and theological precedents that ensured the imperial couple's union would be recognized as legitimate, regardless of any future political changes that might otherwise threaten its acceptance. New laws were proclaimed that made denial of the marriage's legitimacy a capital offence, while religious doctrines were established that incorporated divine marriage into the fundamental theology of the imperial cult. These innovations ensured that future emperors would inherit legal and religious frameworks that supported incestuous marriage as an expression of divine authority rather than moral transgression. As the ceremonies concluded and the exhausted participants began to contemplate the implications of what they had witnessed and supported, it became clear that Roman society had crossed a threshold from which there would be no return to conventional moral frameworks. The empire that emerged from the seven-day celebration was fundamentally different from the one that had existed before, transformed by the systematic destruction of ethical boundaries that had previously constrained imperial behaviour. The marriage of Caligula and Drusilla represented more than just personal scandal or imperial excess. It was the culmination of a systematic campaign to reshape human civilization, according to the will of individuals who recognized no limitations on their authority except those they chose to accept. The ancient world was about to discover what happened when absolute power was wielded by people who had systematically eliminated every moral constraint that might have prevented them from pursuing their darkest impulses. The gods had indeed come down to earth, but they had brought hell with them. Chapter 10. The Price of Divinity. When Gods Bleed. The fever came without warning on a humid August night when even the marble corridors of the imperial palace seemed to sweat with an oppressive heat that no amount of cooling could dispel. Drusilla, the living goddess who had stood beside her brother husband as they reshaped the very foundations of Roman civilization, was suddenly reduced to a trembling, burning figure whose divine flesh proved as vulnerable to mortal disease as any common citizen's body. Caligula's reaction to his sister-wife's illness revealed the depth of psychological dependence that had developed beneath their public displays of divine partnership. The emperor, who had shown such creative enthusiasm for inflicting suffering on others, became a desperate, pleading figure when confronted with pain that he could not control or redirect toward more convenient victims. For the first time since childhood, he found himself face to face with forces that recognized no authority except their own inexorable logic. The imperial physicians, summoned to treat what was clearly no ordinary illness, struggled to maintain their professional composure as they observed symptoms that seemed designed to mock their understanding of both medicine and divine nature. Drusilla's fever burned with supernatural intensity, yet left no lasting damage to her perfect skin. Her convulsions followed patterns that defied medical explanation, while her delirium revealed intimate knowledge of events and conversations that she could never have witnessed in her conscious state. But it was the psychological symptoms that proved most disturbing to those who had grown accustomed to her ruthless intelligence and calculating cruelty. The woman who had demonstrated such sophisticated understanding of human weakness became a babbling creature whose utterances alternated between childlike innocence and prophetic warnings about disasters that would befall the empire if proper divine rituals were not performed with absolute precision. Caligula's attempts to cure his divine wife through the application of imperial authority revealed the limitations of absolute power when confronted with forces that operated according to different rules than political intimidation or military conquest. He issued edicts demanding that the illness cease, ordered physicians to restore her health under penalty of death, and commanded priests to negotiate with whatever gods might be responsible for this assault on imperial divinity. When these conventional approaches proved ineffective, his desperation drove him to increasingly extreme measures that demonstrated the complete collapse of rational thought under the pressure of potential loss. He ordered mass executions of citizens whose crimes supposedly included failing to demonstrate sufficient reverence toward Drusilla's divine nature, as if their deaths might somehow appease whatever supernatural forces had targeted his beloved sister. The most notorious of these revenge executions involved a group of senators who had expressed privately held doubts about the theological legitimacy of divine marriage. Under normal circumstances, such relatively minor expressions of skepticism might have resulted in exile or confiscation of property, but Caligula's current psychological state transformed them into capital offences that demanded the most elaborate punishments his imagination could devise. The senators were not simply killed, but systematically destroyed through processes that took days to complete and involved techniques that pushed the boundaries of human endurance, while ensuring that their suffering would serve as both entertainment for the emperor and warning to other potential doubters. Caligula supervised these executions personally, alternating between periods of manic energy when he directed every detail of the proceedings and moments of complete withdrawal when he would sit motionless for hours, staring at his dying wife with expressions that revealed depths of vulnerability that no one had suspected existed beneath his divine persona. The religious implications of Drusilla's illness created theological crises that challenged every assumption about the nature of imperial divinity that had been carefully constructed during the previous months. If she was truly a goddess, how could mortal diseases affect her divine flesh? If their marriage represented a sacred union ordained by the gods themselves, why would celestial forces permit such suffering to befall their earthly representatives? The priests and theologians who had enthusiastically supported imperial religious innovations found themselves struggling to develop explanations that could preserve the credibility of divine marriage while accounting for the obvious vulnerability that Drusilla's condition revealed. Their efforts produced increasingly elaborate theoretical frameworks that incorporated concepts from mystery religions and Eastern traditions. But these academic exercises provided little comfort to an emperor whose faith in his own divine nature was being systematically undermined by his inability to protect the person he loved most. The most sophisticated of these theological explanations suggested that Drusilla's illness was actually a form of divine trial designed to test the depth of imperial commitment to transcendent principles that surpassed ordinary human understanding. According to this interpretation, her suffering was not evidence of divine weakness, but rather proof of divine strength, demonstrating that true gods were willing to endure mortal pain in order to achieve spiritual purposes that mere humans could not comprehend. But these intellectual arguments provided little solace to Caligula, whose psychological investment in his sister wife went far beyond abstract theological concepts into realms of emotional dependency that he had never fully acknowledged even to himself. As her condition deteriorated, he began displaying behaviours that revealed the terrified child who still existed beneath layers of imperial authority and divine pretension. He would spend entire nights sitting beside her bed, holding conversations with the unconscious figure as if she could hear and respond to his desperate pleas for guidance and reassurance. Palace servants reported overhearing him making promises to unknown supernatural forces, offering to sacrifice entire provinces or populations if they would restore her health and return her to her role as his divine partner and advisor. The political implications of the crisis extended far beyond the immediate question of Drusilla's health into broader concerns about imperial stability and succession planning. Without his sister wife's guidance and support, Caligula's decision-making became increasingly erratic and unpredictable, creating uncertainty that affected everything from routine administrative functions to major military operations that required consistent leadership and clear strategic vision. Provincial governors found themselves receiving contradictory instructions from an emperor whose attention was completely absorbed by personal crisis, while military commanders struggled to implement policies that changed without warning, as imperial priorities shifted according to the emperor's emotional state rather than strategic considerations. The efficient governmental machinery that had been developed during the early years of his reign began to break down under the pressure of leadership that had become fundamentally unreliable. Foreign relations suffered similar disruptions as diplomatic initiatives that had been carefully planned over months were suddenly abandoned or modified in ways that reflected imperial psychological needs rather than rational assessment of Roman interests. Client kingdoms that had adjusted their policies to accommodate imperial religious requirements found themselves facing new demands that seemed designed primarily to provide Caligula with distractions from his personal anguish rather than to serve any coherent political purpose. The economic consequences of the crisis were equally severe, as imperial attention to fiscal policy evaporated in favour of increasingly expensive attempts to purchase divine intervention through elaborate ceremonies and massive sacrificial offerings. The treasury that had been systematically depleted through previous extravagances now faced additional pressure from expenditures that served no practical purpose except providing emotional outlets for an emperor whose grip on reality was becoming increasingly tenuous. The most expensive of these desperate measures involved the construction of massive temple complexes dedicated to various healing deities who might theoretically possess the power to restore Drusilla's health. These projects consumed resources that could have funded entire military campaigns, while providing employment for thousands of workers whose labour produced monuments to imperial desperation rather than structures that served genuine religious or practical purposes. But it was not just the financial cost that made these projects problematic, it was their theological implications for the imperial cult that had been so carefully constructed to support divine marriage. By appealing to traditional gods for assistance with problems that imperial divinity should theoretically have been able to solve independently, Caligula was inadvertently undermining the very religious frameworks that justified his absolute authority over Roman society. The social dynamics within the imperial court underwent dramatic changes as Drusilla's illness progressed, and Caligula's behaviour became increasingly unpredictable and dangerous. Courtiers who had previously competed for imperial attention now found themselves trying to avoid notice from an emperor whose mood could shift without warning from desperate pleading to homicidal rage, often within the span of a single conversation. The survival strategies that had proven effective during previous phases of imperial excess became inadequate for managing an emperor whose psychological state no longer followed rational patterns that could be anticipated and accommodated through conventional political skills. Officials who had learned to read subtle signs of imperial displeasure discovered that their expertise was useless when dealing with someone whose reactions were determined by internal emotional processes rather than external political considerations. Most dangerously, Caligula began to interpret any sign of independent thought or initiative as evidence of disloyalty to his divine person and by extension to Drusilla's welfare. Servants who had previously been valued for their intelligence and competence suddenly found themselves under suspicion for displaying qualities that might theoretically be used to undermine imperial authority during a period of perceived vulnerability. The purges that resulted from these paranoid suspicions were conducted with even less restraint than previous episodes of imperial violence, reflecting Caligula's complete abandonment of any pretense that his actions needed to serve rational political purposes. Citizens were executed for crimes that existed only in the emperor's imagination, while others were tortured to extract confessions of conspiracies that had no basis in reality except as projections of imperial fear and guilt. The most tragic victims of these paranoid episodes were individuals whose only crime was attempting to provide genuine assistance during the medical crisis. Physicians who delivered unfavourable prognoses found themselves accused of deliberately sabotaging Drusilla's recovery, while priests who failed to produce immediate results through their intercessions were charged with secretly working to advance the interests of rival deities who sought to destroy imperial divinity. As summer gave way to autumn and Drusilla's condition continued to deteriorate despite every conceivable form of intervention, Caligula's behaviour reached levels of desperation and irrationality that shocked even observers who had witnessed years of imperial excess. He began making increasingly extravagant promises to supernatural forces, offering not just material sacrifices but fundamental changes to imperial policy that would have transformed the entire structure of Roman government. The most dramatic of these desperate bargains involved his pledge to abdicate imperial authority and live as a private citizen if the gods would restore his sister wife's health and allow their divine marriage to continue in some form that preserved their essential spiritual connection. This offer, made during a public ceremony attended by thousands of witnesses, represented such a complete abandonment of everything he had claimed to value that it called into question his psychological fitness to continue governing the empire. But even this ultimate sacrifice proved insufficient to alter the inexorable progression of disease that was systematically destroying the physical vessel that had contained what Caligula believed to be divine essence. As the first snows began to fall on the 7 hills of Rome, it became clear that no human effort or divine intervention would be sufficient to preserve the life of the woman who had been his closest companion, most trusted advisor, and the anchor that had prevented his megalomania from spiraling completely beyond the bounds of recognizable humanity. The approaching end of Drusilla's life represented more than just personal tragedy for an emperor who had defined himself through their relationship. It threatened to destroy the entire theological and political framework that had justified his most extreme exercises of absolute power. Without her presence to validate his claims of divine authority, he would be forced to confront the possibility that their entire project had been built on delusions rather than genuine supernatural mandate. The stage was set for a psychological collapse that would make his previous demonstrations of imperial excess seem like mere preparation for the true horrors that would follow when grief, rage, and unlimited power combined in the mind of someone who had systematically eliminated every moral constraint that might have prevented him from pursuing vengeance against a world that had dared to take away the only thing he had ever truly loved. Rome was about to discover what happened when a god learned that he could bleed. Chapter 11. The Morning After. When Love Becomes Madness. The scream that echoed through the imperial palace on the night of November 10th was not the cry of a mortal man losing his beloved wife, but the howl of a wounded god whose universe had suddenly collapsed into meaningless chaos. Drusilla was dead, and with her passing the last threads of sanity that had constrained Caligula's descent into absolute madness snapped like overstretched silk beneath the weight of grief too profound for any human soul to contain. For 3 days and 3 nights, the emperor refused to allow anyone to remove her body from their shared bedchamber, sitting beside the cooling corpse in a vigil that transformed love into necromancy and devotion into blasphemy. He spoke to her lifeless form as if she could still hear his words, making plans for future conquests and theological innovations that would require her divine guidance, unable or unwilling to accept that the brilliant mind that had shared his darkest ambitions had been forever silenced by forces beyond even imperial command. the physical deterioration that accompanied his psychological collapse revealed the toll that absolute power and unlimited indulgence had taken on his mortal frame. The emperor who had once moved through palace corridors with predatory grace became a shambling wreck whose eyes burned with fever and whose hands shook with tremors that spoke to neurological damage caused by years of excess and the acute trauma of losing the only person who had ever truly understood the scope of his ambitions. When he finally emerged from his death watch, the transformation was so complete that even experienced courtiers struggled to recognize the figure who had once inspired such perfectly calibrated terror through his combination of intelligence and cruelty. The calculating predator had been replaced by something far more dangerous, a creature of pure impulse whose actions were guided not by strategic considerations, but by the need to inflict suffering that might somehow balance the cosmic injustice of Drusilla's death. His first act upon rejoining the world of the living was to declare Drusilla's official deification, elevating her from living goddess to supreme divine being whose worship would become mandatory throughout the empire. But this was not the dignified posthumous honour typically granted to deceased emperors. It was a theological innovation that demanded immediate implementation of religious practices that pushed the boundaries of acceptable worship into realms that challenged every assumption about the relationship between the living and the dead. Temples dedicated to the divine Drusilla were ordered constructed in every major city throughout the Roman world, their design specifications calling for architectural features that had never been attempted in previous religious construction. The centerpiece of each temple was to be a massive statue that captured not just her physical beauty, but the supernatural radiance that had supposedly emanated from her divine essence during her earthly incarnation. But it was not enough for citizens simply to acknowledge her divine status through conventional religious observances. Caligula demanded forms of worship that required active participation in rituals that violated fundamental taboos about proper relationships between the living and the dead. Devotees were required to conduct imaginary conversations with the deceased goddess, reporting the content of these dialogues to imperial authorities who would evaluate their theological correctness and emotional sincerity. The most disturbing of these mandatory religious practices involved elaborate ceremonies where participants were required to demonstrate their devotion to Drusilla through acts of self-mortification that supposedly allowed them to share in the suffering she had endured during her final illness. These rituals, conducted under the supervision of priests who had been specially trained in techniques of controlled torture, served multiple purposes simultaneously. They provided Caligula with vicarious satisfaction for his inability to prevent her death, while creating shared experiences that bonded participants to the imperial cult through their own blood and pain. The judicial system that had already been transformed into an instrument of imperial entertainment underwent further modifications that reflected Caligula's conviction that Drusilla's death had been caused not by natural disease but by supernatural conspiracy involving enemies who had somehow succeeded in penetrating divine defences through magical or political means. Every citizen became a potential suspect in this cosmic crime, subject to investigation and punishment for actions or thoughts that might theoretically have contributed to the tragedy. The trials that resulted from these paranoid investigations abandoned even the pretense of legal procedure in favour of theatrical spectacles designed to satisfy the Emperor's need for vengeance against a world that had dared to challenge his divine authority by taking away his most precious possession. Defendants were charged not just with specific criminal acts, but with general hostility toward imperial divinity, crimes that were impossible to disprove through conventional legal defense since they involved psychological states rather than observable actions. The most elaborate of these revenge trials involved a group of physicians who had treated Drusilla during her final illness, accused of deliberately providing ineffective medical care as part of a broader conspiracy to undermine imperial authority through the elimination of divine partnership. The proceedings lasted for weeks and featured increasingly fantastic accusations that forced the defendants to argue against charges that became more surreal with each passing day. By the time these trials concluded, the accused had been compelled to confess not just to medical malpractice, but to participation in supernatural conspiracies involving communication with hostile deities, the practice of forbidden magic designed to weaken divine essence, and collaboration with foreign enemies who sought to destroy Roman civilization. by eliminating its divine protectors. The confessions were extracted through techniques that left no physical evidence of coercion, while ensuring that the victims genuinely believed their own testimony by the time they were finally executed. The economic policies implemented during this period of mourning revealed Caligula's determination to transform the entire empire into a massive funeral monument that would demonstrate the cosmic significance of Drusilla's life and death. Public works projects that had previously served practical purposes were redirected toward construction of elaborate memorial complexes that consumed unprecedented resources, while producing structures whose only function was to remind observers of what had been lost when divine partnership was severed by mortal mortality. The most ambitious of these memorial projects involved the creation of a massive artificial lake that would serve as the setting for elaborate naval spectacles, recreating mythological scenes related to divine love and tragic separation. The construction required the displacement of entire communities and the redirection of the major waterways, transforming the landscape around Rome in ways that would serve no practical purpose except providing venues for imperial grief expressed on a scale that matched the emperor's sense of cosmic injustice. The funding for these projects came from increasingly confiscatory taxation policies that treated private wealth as resources that belonged ultimately to the imperial grief rather than to the individuals who had accumulated them through their own efforts. Citizens found themselves required to contribute not just money, but personal possessions that held sentimental value, as if the emperor's loss could somehow be balanced by forcing his subjects to experience proportional deprivation. The military implications of Caligula's psychological collapse created security challenges that threatened the stability of the entire empire, as resources were diverted from practical defense needs toward projects that served purely symbolic purposes. Legions that should have been defending frontier territories found themselves reassigned to construction duties or ceremonial functions that provided no strategic value while leaving vulnerable borders inadequately protected. The most notorious example of this military misuse involved an entire legion that was ordered to spend 6 months collecting shells and pebbles from Mediterranean beaches as materials for a massive mosaic that would depict scenes from Drusilla's earthly life. The soldiers involved in this project were required to approach their duties with the same discipline and enthusiasm they would normally reserve for genuine military operations, creating training exercises that prepared them for nothing except participation in increasingly elaborate expressions of imperial madness. Foreign relations deteriorated rapidly as diplomatic initiatives were abandoned in favour of demands that client kingdoms and allied nations participate in mourning rituals that violated their own religious traditions and political customs. Ambassadors found themselves required to participate in ceremonies acknowledging Drusilla's divine status before being permitted to conduct any official business, while tribute payments were restructured to emphasize their significance as offerings to the deceased goddess rather than practical contributions to imperial revenues. The most dramatic diplomatic crisis involved the Kingdom of Egypt, whose rulers had maintained cordial relationships with Rome for generations, but found themselves unable to comply with religious requirements that contradicted fundamental aspects of their own theological traditions. Rather than negotiating accommodations that might have preserved the alliance, Caligula interpreted their hesitation as evidence of conspiracy against divine memory and began planning military operations designed to punish their insufficient reverence. But it was the transformation of his personal relationships that provided the clearest indication of how completely grief had destroyed whatever remained of his capacity for human connection. The courtiers and family members who had previously served as sources of counsel and companionship were systematically excluded from imperial favour, as Caligula became convinced that no living person could provide the kind of understanding and support he had received from his divine sister wife. His surviving sisters, Agrippina the Younger and Julia Livilla, found themselves subjected to increasingly erratic treatment that alternated between desperate attempts to recreate his relationship with Drusilla and savage punishment for their failure to adequately replace what had been lost. He would demand that they participate in elaborate role-playing exercises where they pretended to be Drusilla temporarily returned from the divine realm, then rage against them for their inability to maintain the illusion with sufficient conviction. The psychological techniques he employed during these sessions revealed sophisticated understanding of how grief could be weaponized to inflict suffering that went far beyond conventional torture. Rather than simply causing physical pain, he specialised in creating situations where his victims were forced to participate in their own emotional destruction, making them complicit in preserving memories that served his psychological needs while systematically destroying their individual identities. The most disturbing aspect of these familial relationships was his growing conviction that Drusilla's death had been caused by insufficient devotion from other family members whose failure to love her adequately had somehow weakened her divine essence and made her vulnerable to mortal disease. This belief provided justification for increasingly severe punishments, designed not just to satisfy his need for revenge, but to prevent similar tragedies through the elimination of anyone whose loyalty might prove inadequate in future crises. As winter deepened and the anniversary of Drusilla's death approached, Caligula's behaviour reached levels of irrationality and excess that made his previous demonstrations of imperial power seem restrained by comparison. He began making public appearances dressed in women's clothing that had supposedly belonged to his deceased sister wife, claiming that her divine spirit occasionally possessed his mortal form to provide guidance on important governmental decisions. These possession episodes, whether genuine psychological phenomena or elaborate theatrical performances, served to demonstrate his continued connection to divine authority while providing explanations for policy decisions that might otherwise seem too extreme even by the standards he had already established. Citizens who might question the wisdom of particular imperial actions were reminded that their emperor was serving as a vessel for supernatural intelligence that transcended ordinary human understanding. The religious ceremonies that marked the first anniversary of Drusilla's death represented the culmination of a year-long campaign to transform personal grief into public worship, creating new forms of mandatory devotion that pushed the boundaries of acceptable religious practice far beyond anything previously attempted in Roman society. The week-long observances required participation from every citizen in the empire, creating shared experiences of mourning and worship that bound the population to imperial mythology, while demonstrating the scope of resources that could be mobilized in the service of imperial emotion. But even these unprecedented displays of grief and devotion could not fill the psychological void that Drusilla's death had created in the mind of an emperor whose sense of identity had been fundamentally dependent on their partnership. As the anniversary ceremonies concluded and normal governmental functions resumed, it became increasingly clear that Caligula's capacity for rational leadership had been permanently destroyed by losses that no amount of public mourning could heal. The empire that had celebrated his accession with such enthusiasm now found itself ruled by a creature whose connection to human reality had been severed by grief too profound for any mortal mind to process without complete psychological collapse. The monster they had created through years of flattery and enabling was about to reveal the true depths of horror that lay beneath imperial pretensions to divine authority, and Rome was running out of time to save itself from the consequences of its own political cowardice. The mourning was ending, but the madness was just beginning. Chapter 12. The Final Spectacle. Dancing on Empire's Grave. In the blood-soaked amphitheatre of his own making, Caligula stood like a twisted god presiding over the systematic destruction of everything that had once made Rome great. The fourth year of his reign had become a carnival of horrors, where sanity was treason, cruelty was art, and the very concept of human dignity was ground beneath the sandaled feet of an emperor who had finally abandoned any pretense that his actions served purposes beyond his own demented pleasure. The morning of January 15th dawned grey and cold over a capital city that had learned to hold its breath whenever the emperor appeared in public, for his presence now carried with it the promise of spectacles that pushed the boundaries of human endurance, while serving no purpose except to demonstrate that absolute power could transform even the most civilized society into a playground for systematic sadism. On this particular morning, the citizens of Rome were about to witness an entertainment that would remain seared into their collective memory long after the empire itself had crumbled to dust. Caligula had announced that the day's gladiatorial games would feature a special exhibition designed to honour the memory of his divine sister wife, while providing education in the proper relationship between gods and mortals. The arena had been specially prepared for this event, with elaborate stage sets that transformed the familiar sand and stone into a fantastical landscape, supposedly representing the realm of the dead, where Drusilla now reigned as supreme goddess over departed souls. But the true innovation lay not in the visual spectacle, but in the selection of participants. For Caligula had decreed that this particular entertainment would feature not professional gladiators, but members of the Roman Senate who had been chosen to demonstrate their devotion to imperial divinity through personal combat that would serve both religious and political purposes. These were not criminals or slaves fighting for their freedom, but the hereditary aristocrats of the most powerful empire in the world, forced to shed each other's blood for the amusement of a madman who had convinced himself that their suffering would somehow balance the cosmic injustice of his personal loss. The senators who found themselves trapped in this nightmare had spent months trying to rationalize their participation through elaborate philosophical arguments that transformed cowardice into virtue and collaboration into patriotic duty. They told themselves that their compliance served the greater good of imperial stability, that resistance would only result in their replacement by even more compliant successors, that their sacrifice might somehow satisfy the emperor's bloodlust and prevent worse atrocities against innocent citizens. But as they stood in the arena wearing gladiatorial equipment that had been specially crafted to ensure maximum spectacle while prolonging the agony of combat, these rationalizations dissolved into the simple terror of men who had finally understood that their civilization had produced something that transcended ordinary evil and entered realms where conventional moral categories no longer applied. They were about to die not for any crime they had committed, but simply because their emperor found their suffering entertaining. Caligula himself presided over the proceedings from a golden throne that had been positioned to provide optimal viewing angles while elevating him above the carnage in a manner that emphasized his divine status as the ultimate arbiter of life and death. He wore ceremonial robes that incorporated elements supposedly blessed by Drusilla's spirit, while a crown of gold and precious stones caught the weak winter sunlight and transformed him into a figure that seemed to blur the boundary between earthly authority and supernatural power. The crowd that packed the amphitheatre represented every level of Roman society, from wealthy merchants and foreign dignitaries who had been commanded to attend, to common citizens who had been promised free bread and wine in exchange for their enthusiastic participation in the imperial entertainment. But their reactions to the unfolding spectacle revealed the psychological damage that 4 years of systematic moral corruption had inflicted on an entire civilization. Where previous generations might have recoiled in horror from the sight of senators being forced to murder each other for imperial amusement, this audience cheered with genuine enthusiasm that reflected their complete internalization of the values that Caligula had systematically promoted through years of carefully orchestrated brutality. They had been trained to see suffering as entertainment, cruelty as strength, and the destruction of human dignity as proof of divine authority that deserved celebration rather than resistance. The combat itself was choreographed to maximize both the physical suffering of the participants and the educational value of their destruction for observers who needed constant reminders about the consequences of insufficient loyalty to imperial divinity. Rather than allowing quick deaths that might inspire sympathy or admiration, the rules ensured that wounds were inflicted in patterns that would cause maximum pain while prolonging consciousness until the very end. But it was not just the physical violence that made this spectacle so effective as a tool of political control. It was the psychological dimension that forced participants to actively collaborate in their own destruction while providing justifications that transformed their cowardice into virtue. The senators were required to deliver speeches before combat explaining how their voluntary participation demonstrated their devotion to imperial authority and their gratitude for the opportunity to serve divine purposes through their blood. These forced testimonials, delivered by men who knew they were about to die but were compelled to express enthusiasm for their own execution, created powerful psychological effects on observers who witnessed the complete capitulation of individuals who had previously represented the pinnacle of social authority and intellectual respectability. If senators could be reduced to grateful victims who praised their own destruction, what hope did ordinary citizens have of maintaining any form of meaningful resistance to imperial demands? The most devastating moment in the entire spectacle came when Marcus Lepidus, a senator whose family had served Rome with distinction for generations, was forced to execute his own son as the final demonstration of loyalty before being allowed to die himself. The young man, barely 20 years old and guilty of no crime except being born into a family that had attracted imperial attention, knelt in the sand while his father raised a gladiator's sword with hands that trembled not from fear, but from the complete psychological collapse that accompanied the systematic destruction of every moral principle that had previously given his life meaning. The crowd's reaction to this ultimate violation of natural law revealed the depth of corruption that had been achieved through years of systematic indoctrination in the values of absolute submission to imperial authority. Rather than horror or sympathy, they responded with thunderous applause that celebrated the father's demonstration of proper priorities, cheering louder for his willingness to murder his own child than they had for any previous display of combat skill or courage. Caligula watched these proceedings with visible satisfaction that went beyond simple sadistic pleasure into realms of genuine artistic appreciation, as if he were observing a masterpiece of theatrical performance rather than the systematic destruction of human souls. He provided commentary throughout the proceedings that revealed sophisticated understanding of the psychological techniques being employed, explaining to distinguished foreign guests how each element of the spectacle serves specific purposes in the broader project of reshaping human civilization according to divine specifications. His analysis demonstrated that these were not random acts of cruelty, but components of a comprehensive system designed to eliminate every form of independent thought or moral resistance that might theoretically challenge imperial authority. By forcing citizens to participate actively in celebrating what their own consciences recognized as abominable, he was systematically destroying their capacity for ethical judgment while creating psychological dependencies that made rebellion literally unthinkable. The foreign dignitaries who witnessed these events understood immediately that they were observing not just imperial entertainment, but a demonstration of techniques that could be applied to their own populations if they failed to maintain appropriate levels of compliance with Roman demands. The message was clear: this was what happened to civilizations that produced leaders capable of such systematic creativity in the application of absolute power, and similar innovations might be exported to any territory that required more intensive methods of political control. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire spectacle was Caligula's obvious conviction that his actions served legitimate religious purposes that honoured Drusilla's memory, while strengthening the spiritual foundations of imperial authority. He genuinely believed that the suffering he orchestrated was a form of worship that pleased the divine powers who had granted him dominion over the mortal world, and that resistance to his methods constituted blasphemy against the natural order of the universe. This theological framework provided him with intellectual justifications that transformed even his most extreme cruelties into sacred duties that he was obligated to perform regardless of any personal preferences he might have for more conventional forms of governance. He had convinced himself that mercy was actually a form of spiritual weakness that dishonoured the gods by failing to demonstrate proper appreciation for the powers they had granted to their earthly representatives. As the day's entertainments reached their climax with the ritual execution of the surviving combatants, Caligula rose from his throne to deliver a speech that summarized the lessons that observers were expected to derive from what they had witnessed. His words, preserved by scribes and distributed throughout the empire as official imperial doctrine, provided a comprehensive statement of the political and theological principles that justified absolute tyranny as the highest expression of divine will made manifest in human government. He explained that the senators who had died in the arena had achieved a form of immortality through their service to imperial divinity, transforming their apparent destruction into spiritual elevation that granted them honoured positions in the celestial hierarchy that governed the universe. Their suffering had not been meaningless, but had served as sacrificial offerings that strengthened the connection between earthly and divine authority, while providing entertainment that demonstrated imperial benevolence towards citizens who deserved such magnificent spectacles. The crowd's response to this theological interpretation revealed the complete success of his long campaign to reshape public consciousness according to specifications that made resistance psychologically impossible for individuals who had been systematically trained to see their own moral instincts as evidence of insufficient loyalty to legitimate authority. They cheered not just for the emperor's words, but for the intellectual framework that transformed their own complicity in atrocity into evidence of spiritual sophistication and political wisdom. But even as Caligula basked in the adulation of subjects who had been successfully conditioned to celebrate their own moral corruption, forces were already in motion that would soon demonstrate the ultimate limitations of power based purely on terror and systematic cruelty. In the shadows of the amphitheatre, members of the Praetorian Guard exchanged glances that spoke to conversations held in secret places where even imperial surveillance could not penetrate, planning actions that would restore honour to institutions that had been systematically corrupted through years of collaboration with evil. The final spectacle was drawing to a close, but the curtain was about to rise on an even more dramatic performance, where the roles would be reversed, and the architect of so much suffering would discover what it felt like to experience the terror he had spent years inflicting on others. Rome was about to reclaim its soul through an act of violence that would echo through the corridors of history as proof that even the most absolute tyranny contained within itself the seeds of its own destruction. The empire had learned to dance in chains, but it was about to remember how to break them. Chapter 13, Shadows Conspire, the Praetorians' Plot. In the deepest hours before dawn, when even the marble statues seemed to shiver in the cold January air, Cassius Chaerea stood in the underground chambers beneath the imperial palace, where the Praetorian Guard kept their most sensitive equipment and held their most dangerous conversations. The veteran centurion's scarred hands trembled not with fear, but with barely controlled rage as he contemplated the oath he had sworn decades earlier to protect the Emperor's life, an oath that had transformed him from honourable soldier into willing accomplice in the systematic destruction of everything he had once believed made Rome worthy of his devotion. Around him in the flickering torchlight stood a carefully selected group of fellow conspirators, men whose faces bore the same expression of grim determination, mixed with profound shame that characterized all who had been forced to witness the daily atrocities that passed for imperial governance. These were not ambitious politicians seeking personal advancement or foreign agents working to undermine Roman power. They were career soldiers who had reached the psychological breaking point where continued obedience to legitimate authority had become morally indistinguishable from active participation in evil. The conversation that unfolded in those shadowy chambers would have been considered treason by any conventional definition, but the men who participated understood that conventional categories no longer applied to a situation where the Emperor himself had systematically violated every principle that gave governmental authority its moral legitimacy. They were not plotting against Rome but for it, seeking to restore honour to institutions that had been corrupted through years of collaboration with a madman who had transformed divine authority into a license for unlimited cruelty. Cassius Chaerea spoke first, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had commanded men in desperate situations and understood the psychological requirements for transforming dangerous plans into successful action. He outlined the fundamental contradiction that had made their conspiracy inevitable. They had sworn oaths to protect an emperor whose continued existence posed a greater threat to Roman civilization than any external enemy the empire had ever faced. "We are not murderers planning an assassination," he told his assembled colleagues in words that would be remembered and repeated in whispered conversations for generations to come. "We are surgeons preparing to remove a cancer that threatens to destroy the entire body politic. Our oaths bound us to preserve the empire, and that duty now requires us to eliminate the man whose madness has made him its greatest enemy." The philosophical framework that supported their conspiracy drew on genuine Roman legal and moral traditions that distinguished between legitimate governmental authority and tyrannical power that had forfeited its claim to obedience through systematic violation of the principles that justified its existence. They were not rebels seeking to overthrow lawful government, but guardians of constitutional order who had recognized that their emperor's actions had placed him outside the legal frameworks that normally protected imperial authority. But the intellectual justifications for their planned action, however sophisticated and legally grounded, could not eliminate the practical dangers that any attempt to assassinate the most heavily protected individual in the Roman world would inevitably entail. Caligula was surrounded at all times by layers of security that had been designed to prevent exactly the kind of conspiracy they were contemplating, while his unpredictable behaviour patterns made it nearly impossible to plan operations that depended on his presence at specific locations during predetermined time periods. The security challenges were compounded by the psychological warfare techniques that the emperor employed to maintain control over his own protection detail, creating an atmosphere of mutual suspicion and paranoia that made coordination between potential conspirators extremely difficult. Guards were regularly rotated between different assignments to prevent the formation of personal relationships that might evolve into conspiracy networks, while loyalty was tested through elaborate schemes designed to identify and eliminate anyone whose devotion to imperial authority might prove inadequate under pressure. Most dangerously, Caligula had developed sophisticated techniques for using apparent expressions of dissatisfaction as tools for identifying and neutralizing potential threats before they could mature into genuine dangers. Guards who expressed even mild criticism of imperial policies often found themselves promoted to positions of greater responsibility and trust, only to discover later that their elevation had been designed to test whether increased access to imperial persons and places would tempt them into treasonous action. The conspiracy that Cassius Chaerea was organising had to operate within this environment of systematic surveillance and psychological manipulation, developing communication methods and operational plans that could function effectively despite the constant presence of informants and the ever-present possibility that their entire effort had been detected and was being monitored by imperial agents who were allowing it to proceed only to identify all participants before moving to eliminate them. The selection of conspirators had been the most delicate aspect of the entire operation, requiring careful evaluation not just of individual courage and competence, but of psychological profiles that could predict behaviour under the extreme pressure of executing a plan that would either save the empire or result in the torturous deaths of everyone involved. The men chosen for participation had been observed and evaluated over months of careful surveillance, their reactions to various forms of imperial excess noted and analysed to determine their likely reliability when the moment for action finally arrived. Marcus Vinicius brought to the conspiracy the tactical expertise that came from years of experience in planning and executing complex military operations under adverse conditions. His analysis of the imperial palace's defensive arrangements revealed vulnerabilities that could be exploited by individuals with intimate knowledge of guard rotations and security protocols. But he emphasized repeatedly that any successful assassination attempt would require precise timing and flawless execution, since there would be no opportunity for improvisation once the operation began. Cornelius Sabinus contributed intelligence about the emperor's personal habits and psychological patterns that had been gathered through careful observation during his service as a senior centurion, with regular access to imperial quarters. His reports painted a picture of an individual whose paranoid suspicions had actually created blind spots in his personal security arrangements, as his conviction that enemies would approach through conventional channels had led him to neglect more obvious vulnerabilities. Most importantly, Sabinus had identified a regular pattern in Caligula's movements that created a brief window of opportunity during which he would be relatively isolated from his usual protective detail, while remaining accessible to individuals with legitimate reasons for being in his vicinity. The emperor's habit of attending theatrical performances in underground chambers beneath the palace provided the conspirators with their best chance of reaching him, in an environment where escape routes could be controlled and where the sounds of violence would be muffled by stone walls and masked by the noise of ongoing entertainment. The weapon selection for the assassination required careful consideration of tactical effectiveness, balanced against the symbolic significance that their choice would carry for future generations who would judge their actions. They needed instruments that would ensure quick death while avoiding excessive brutality that might create martyrdom narratives useful to imperial propagandists seeking to portray the assassination as the work of sadistic criminals rather than honourable soldiers performing necessary duties. After extensive discussion, they settled on traditional Roman military daggers that would allow multiple conspirators to participate directly in the killing, while ensuring that no single individual could be identified as the primary assassin. This approach served both practical and philosophical purposes, distributing responsibility for the emperor's death among multiple participants, while symbolically representing the collective judgment of the military institutions that Caligula had systematically corrupted through his abuse of their oath of loyalty. The timing of their planned action was influenced by intelligence reports, indicating that the emperor's behaviour was becoming increasingly erratic and dangerous, suggesting that delays might result in atrocities that would make their eventual success meaningless if it came too late to prevent further systematic destruction of Roman civilization. Recent executions had targeted individuals whose only crime was possessing bloodlines that theoretically qualified them for imperial succession, indicating that Caligula was moving toward the complete elimination of potential alternatives to his continued rule. But the most compelling argument for immediate action came from reports about the emperor's latest theological innovations, which involved plans for ceremonies that would formally establish him as the supreme deity of a new religious system that would replace traditional Roman gods with worship centered exclusively on his divine person. These plans represented such a fundamental challenge to the spiritual foundations of Roman civilization that their implementation would make future resistance psychologically impossible for citizens who had been systematically trained to see opposition to imperial authority as blasphemy against divine will. The psychological preparation required for carrying out an assassination involved more than simply steeling themselves for violence. It required the systematic elimination of emotional and moral constraints that had been carefully cultivated through years of military training and social conditioning. These men had been taught from childhood to revere imperial authority and to see regicide as the most heinous crime imaginable, making their planned action a violation of everything they had previously believed about duty, honour, and loyalty. Cassius Chaerea addressed this psychological challenge through a series of private conversations that reframed their planned action within traditional Roman concepts of virtue and patriotic duty, arguing that their willingness to sacrifice their own moral comfort for the greater good of the empire represented the highest expression of the military values they had sworn to uphold. They were not betraying their oaths, but fulfilling them in the only way that remained possible under circumstances that had made conventional loyalty indistinguishable from collaboration with evil. The final preparations for their assassination attempt required the coordination of multiple moving parts that had to function perfectly, despite the complete impossibility of conducting rehearsals or testing their plans under realistic conditions. Guard rotations had to be subtly modified to ensure that conspirators would be in the right positions at the crucial moment, while alternative security arrangements had to be neutralized without arousing suspicions that might trigger investigations before their operation could be completed. The most delicate aspect of these preparations involved the management of non-conspirator guards who would be present during the assassination, but could not be trusted with advanced knowledge of the planned action. These individuals had to be positioned where they could be quickly neutralized or converted into allies once violence began, while ensuring that their ignorance of the plot would not interfere with its execution at critical moments. As the final preparations neared completion, each conspirator spent private hours contemplating the personal consequences that would inevitably follow their success or failure. Success would bring them the satisfaction of having saved Roman civilization from complete moral collapse, but it would also mark them forever as regicides whose actions had violated the most fundamental taboos of their society. Failure would result in death so prolonged and agonizing that simple execution would seem like mercy by comparison. But these personal considerations paled beside their shared recognition that the choice they faced was not between safety and danger, but between active resistance to evil and passive complicity in the systematic destruction of everything that had once made their civilization worthy of respect and admiration. They had reached the point where honor demanded action regardless of personal consequences, where duty required them to risk everything in an attempt to restore moral legitimacy to institutions that had been corrupted beyond recognition. The night before their planned assassination, Cassius Chaerea gathered his conspirators for a final meeting where they reaffirmed their commitment to the action while acknowledging the magnitude of what they were attempting. They were not just planning to kill an emperor, they were seeking to restore the spiritual foundations of Roman civilization by demonstrating that even absolute power had limits that could be enforced through the application of righteous violence. Tomorrow, Chaerea told them in words that would be carved into secret monuments, erected by future generations of Romans who understood the significance of their sacrifice. We will discover whether our civilization retains enough moral strength to save itself from the monster it has created. Whether we succeed or fail, history will remember that when Rome faced its darkest hour, some of its sons chose honor over safety and duty over comfort. The die was cast, the plans were finalized, and the fate of the Roman Empire would soon be determined by whether a small group of loyal soldiers possessed the courage and competence necessary to eliminate a tyrant whose continued existence threatened to transform the greatest civilization in human history into a cautionary tale about the dangers of unlimited power placed in the hands of someone who had systematically eliminated every moral constraint that might have prevented him from pursuing his darkest impulses. The shadows were ready to strike, and Rome would soon learn whether virtue retained enough strength to triumph over the forces of systematic evil that had been unleashed by 4 years of absolute tyranny, unchecked by any external restraint or internal moral limitation. In Chapter 14, The Ides of Blood, Death of a God, the underground corridors beneath the imperial palace echoed with the sound of approaching footsteps, as Caligula made his way toward what he believed would be another afternoon of theatrical entertainment, unaware that he was walking directly into the carefully prepared trap that would finally bring his reign of terror to its bloody conclusion. The date was January 24th, 44 AD, and the emperor who had spent 4 years convincing himself and his subjects that he was a living god was about to discover the ultimate limitations of divine pretension when confronted with mortal steel wielded by men who had chosen honour over safety. The theatrical performance that served as the setting for his assassination had been carefully selected to provide both symbolic appropriateness and tactical advantage for the conspirators who had spent months planning every detail of the operation. The play being performed was a tragedy about the fall of a tyrant, chosen by Cassius Chaerea with deliberate irony that would be appreciated by future historians even if its significance was lost on the emperor himself in his final moments of life. Caligula's mood that morning had been particularly volatile, alternating between periods of manic energy and sudden descents into the brooding melancholy that had characterized his behavior since Drusilla's death. Palace servants had reported that he had spent the early hours in animated conversation with invisible companions whom he claimed were divine messengers, providing guidance about future policy decisions, followed by extended periods of motionless silence during which he stared at empty air with expressions of profound sadness. The emperor's entourage for the day's entertainment included the usual collection of sycophantic courtiers, foreign dignitaries, and carefully selected citizens whose presence served to validate imperial policies through their enthusiastic participation in whatever spectacles might be provided for their edification. But hidden among this familiar crowd were the conspirators who had positioned themselves according to predetermined plans that would allow them to isolate their target while preventing effective intervention from his protective detail. The seating arrangements in the underground theatre had been subtly modified to create the tactical situation that the assassination required, with conspirators distributed throughout the audience in positions that would allow rapid movement toward the imperial box, while cutting off escape routes and preventing coordinated defensive action by guards whose loyalty to the emperor remained genuine. The lighting had been adjusted to create shadowy areas where initial violence could occur without immediately alerting the entire audience to what was happening. As the performance began, and Caligula settled into his ornate chair to enjoy what he anticipated would be another demonstration of his cultural sophistication and imperial generosity, the conspirators made their final preparations for action that would transform them from loyal servants into regicides whose names would be remembered long after the empire itself had crumbled to dust. Each man performed final equipment checks while monitoring the positions of non-conspirator guards and evaluating potential complications that might require improvisation during the execution phase. The signal for action came during the play's climactic scene, when the fictional tyrant was confronted by rebels who had finally gathered sufficient courage to challenge his authority. As the actors on stage delivered speeches about the moral necessity of eliminating rulers who had forfeited their legitimacy through systematic abuse of power, Cassius Chaerea rose from his seat and began moving toward the imperial box with the measured pace of someone performing routine security duties, rather than advancing to commit the most significant political assassination in Roman history. Caligula's first indication that something unusual was occurring came when he noticed the coordinated movement of multiple guards toward his position. But his initial reaction was curiosity rather than alarm, since such behaviour might indicate nothing more serious than a security drill or the arrival of unexpected visitors who required imperial attention. His years of absolute power had made him psychologically incapable of genuinely believing that anyone would dare to threaten his divine person, despite the obvious hatred that his policies had generated among virtually every segment of Roman society. The moment of recognition came when Caligula saw the naked blade in Cassius Chaerea's hand, and finally understood that he was facing not additional security, but immediate mortal danger from men who had decided that their oaths of loyalty no longer applied to an emperor who had systematically violated every principle that gave governmental authority its moral legitimacy. The expression that crossed his face in that instant of comprehension would be described by witnesses as a mixture of complete shock, desperate fear, and genuine bewilderment that anyone would dare to challenge someone who possessed divine authority over life and death. His first words were not defiant threats or imperial commands, but a plaintive question that revealed the depth of his psychological dependence on the myth of his own invulnerability. "What are you doing? I am your emperor. I am a god!" The pathetic quality of this appeal, delivered in a voice that cracked with terror, provided the conspirators with final confirmation that they were eliminating not a divine being, but a mortal man whose pretensions to supernatural status had been exposed as elaborate delusions designed to mask fundamental human weakness and cowardice. Cassius Chaerea's response came not in words, but in action, as he drove his dagger into the emperor's chest with a force that demonstrated both his military training and his absolute commitment to completing the task regardless of any personal consequences that might follow. The blade penetrated between ribs and found the heart that had pumped blood through veins, that carried the poison of absolute corruption to every corner of the Roman world, while Caligula's scream echoed through the underground chamber with a sound that combined physical agony with the psychological terror of someone discovering that his most fundamental beliefs about his own nature had been complete fabrications. But Cassius Chaerea was not the only conspirator who participated directly in the emperor's death, as the plan called for multiple wounds that would ensure quick death, while distributing responsibility among several participants who shared both the honour and the moral burden of eliminating a tyrant whose continued existence threatened the spiritual foundations of Roman civilization. Cornelius Sabinus, Marcus Vinicius, and 3 other conspirators struck in rapid succession, their blades finding vital organs with the precision that came from careful planning and extensive military experience in the art of killing. The emperor's death throes lasted only minutes, but those final moments provided him with a concentrated experience of the helplessness and terror that he had inflicted on thousands of victims during his 4-year reign of systematic cruelty. As his divine blood pooled on the marble floor, and his supernatural authority revealed itself as nothing more than the conventional mortality that governed all human existence, Caligula experienced what every one of his victims had felt: the complete vulnerability of mortal flesh when confronted with forces that recognized no authority except their own determination to inflict suffering. His final words, gasped out between bubbles of blood that rose from punctured lungs, were reported by witnesses as a desperate plea for mercy that demonstrated his complete abandonment of the imperial dignity he had spent years claiming as evidence of his divine nature. "Please, I don't want to die. I have so much more to accomplish." The irony of these words, spoken by someone who had never shown mercy to anyone who had begged for their lives, was not lost on the conspirators who watched him expire, with the grim satisfaction of men who had finally succeeded in balancing cosmic scales that had been tilted toward evil for far too long. The immediate aftermath of the assassination created chaos throughout the underground theatre, as audience members struggled to comprehend what they had witnessed, while the conspirators moved quickly to secure the area and prevent any organised resistance from guards whose loyalty to the dead emperor might motivate them to seek immediate revenge. The confusion was compounded by the darkness of the underground setting, and the suddenness of violence that had transformed a routine cultural event into the most significant political moment in recent Roman history. Some members of the audience fled immediately toward exits that the conspirators had not yet secured, carrying news of the emperor's death to other parts of the palace, where it would trigger reactions ranging from relief and celebration to genuine grief, and calls for vengeance against the regicides who had dared to violate the sacred person of their divine ruler. Others remained frozen in their seats, uncertain whether the violence they had witnessed was part of the theatrical performance or genuine political action that might require specific responses from citizens who wanted to avoid being identified as either supporters or opponents of the new order. The Praetorian guards, who had not been included in the conspiracy, found themselves facing the most challenging decision of their military careers, as they were forced to choose between loyalty to their dead emperor and pragmatic acceptance of the new political reality that his assassination had created. Some attempted to organize resistance against the conspirators, but their efforts were hampered by uncertainty about who could be trusted and confusion about what orders they should follow in a situation that had no precedent in Roman military doctrine. The most dramatic confrontation occurred when several guards who had been genuinely devoted to Caligula attempted to fight their way to his body, apparently believing that they might somehow reverse what had occurred, or at least die honourably in defence of imperial authority. These men were killed by the conspirators with the same efficiency that had characterised the assassination itself, their blood joining that of their emperor on marble floors that had witnessed the end of an era and the beginning of an uncertain new chapter in Roman history. As news of the emperor's death spread throughout the palace and began to reach other parts of the city, the conspirators faced the crucial challenge of managing the immediate political consequences of their action, while ensuring that the power vacuum created by Caligula's elimination did not result in civil war or the emergence of another tyrant who might prove even more dangerous than the one they had just eliminated. They had succeeded in removing a monster from power, but they had not yet secured the systemic changes that would prevent the emergence of future monsters who might exploit the same institutional weaknesses that had enabled Caligula's rise. The search for Caligula's surviving family members began immediately, as the conspirators understood that allowing potential heirs to escape might provide focal points for resistance movements that could threaten the stability of whatever new government emerged from the political chaos that would inevitably follow the assassination. His wife Caesonia and infant daughter Julia Drusilla were located within hours and executed with the same methodical efficiency that had characterized the elimination of their husband and father, ensuring that no legitimate claimants to imperial authority would survive to complicate the succession process. But even as the conspirators moved to consolidate their immediate tactical success, they understood that their greatest challenges lay ahead in the form of political decisions that would determine whether their assassination had merely replaced one form of tyranny with another, or had actually succeeded in restoring constitutional government that could prevent future abuses of imperial authority. They had proven that even absolute power had limits that could be enforced through righteous violence, but they had not yet demonstrated whether Roman civilization retained sufficient moral strength to rebuild itself according to principles that would prevent the repetition of the horrors they had just ended. The body of the man who had claimed to be a living god lay cooling in its own blood, providing silent testimony to the ultimate futility of human pretensions to divine authority when confronted with mortal determination to restore justice and honour to institutions that had been systematically corrupted through years of collaboration with evil. Caligula was dead, but the empire he had nearly destroyed still faced the challenge of healing wounds that went far deeper than the physical damage his policies had inflicted on individual victims. The age of divine madness was ending, but the age of restoration had not yet begun, and Rome would soon discover whether its citizens possessed the wisdom and courage necessary to learn from their experience with tyranny and build governmental systems that could prevent future emperors from following the path that had led their civilization to the brink of complete moral collapse. The god was dead, but the work of rebuilding civilization had only just begun. Chapter 15. After the Storm, Empire Reborn in Blood. The silence that followed the assassination was more deafening than any scream that had ever echoed through the palace corridors. A profound quiet that seemed to emanate from the very stones themselves, as if the building were holding its breath, while contemplating the magnitude of what had just occurred within its walls. For the first time in 4 years, Rome was free from the presence of the madman who had transformed the greatest empire in human history into a theatre of systematic cruelty, but that freedom came with the terrible responsibility of determining what would rise from the ashes of absolute tyranny. In the immediate aftermath of Caligula's death, the conspirators found themselves confronting challenges that their careful planning had not fully anticipated, as the elimination of a tyrant proved to be far simpler than the restoration of legitimate government to institutions that had been systematically corrupted through years of collaboration with evil. The power vacuum created by the emperor's assassination threatened to produce chaos that might prove even more destructive than the organised madness it had replaced, while various factions within the imperial hierarchy manoeuvred to position themselves advantageously in whatever new order might emerge. The Senate, whose members had spent years perfecting the arts of sycophantic submission to imperial authority, struggled to comprehend that they were suddenly expected to resume the governmental responsibilities that they had systematically abandoned in exchange for personal safety and continued access to imperial favour. The skills required for genuine political leadership had atrophied through disuse, while the psychological habits developed during the Reign of Terror made independent decision-making seem impossibly dangerous, even after the source of that danger had been permanently eliminated. Their first meeting following news of the assassination revealed the depth of institutional damage that 4 years of tyranny had inflicted on Roman political culture. Senators who gathered in emergency session found themselves unable to conduct coherent discussions about urgent policy questions, as their conversations devolved into mutual recriminations about past collaboration with Caligula's regime and desperate attempts to establish alibis for actions that had been necessary for survival, but were now sources of shame and potential legal liability. The most senior members of the senatorial class, men whose experience dated back to the principled governance that had characterized Augustus's reign, attempted to provide leadership during this crucial transition period, but their efforts were hampered by the recognition that they themselves had been compromised through years of enforced participation in ceremonies and votes that had legitimized policies they privately recognized as abominable. The moral authority necessary for rebuilding governmental institutions had been systematically undermined through the very collaboration that had allowed them to survive long enough to participate in the restoration process. Meanwhile, in the military camps surrounding Rome, the legions that formed the backbone of imperial power wrestled with their own complex reactions to news of their emperor's violent death. The soldiers who had sworn oaths of personal loyalty to Caligula found themselves confronting fundamental questions about the nature of military duty and political obligation that their training had never prepared them to address, while officers who had been promoted based on their enthusiasm for imperial policies suddenly discovered that their career advancement had been built on foundations that were no longer politically viable. The Praetorian Guard, whose members had been most directly involved in either planning or witnessing the assassination, faced the immediate challenge of maintaining order within the capital, while managing their own internal divisions between conspirators who celebrated the elimination of a tyrant and loyalists who viewed the regicide as a betrayal of sacred military oaths that transcended any political considerations about the emperor's fitness for office. Cassius Chaerea, despite his central role in planning and executing the assassination, recognized that the success of their immediate tactical operation would prove meaningless unless they could establish stable governmental institutions capable of preventing the emergence of future tyrants who might exploit the same systemic weaknesses that had enabled Caligula's rise to absolute power. But his attempts to organize a provisional government were complicated by the reluctance of surviving political leaders to associate themselves too closely with regicides whose actions, however justified, had violated the most fundamental taboos of Roman political culture. The search for a new emperor became the focus of desperate negotiations between various factions whose competing interests threatened to produce the kind of civil conflict that had characterized the final decades of the Republic before Augustus had imposed imperial order through superior military force and political skill. The irony was not lost on thoughtful observers that the conspiracy designed to restore constitutional government might ultimately necessitate the selection of another autocratic ruler whose authority would depend on the same military support that had enabled Caligula's excesses. The most viable candidate for imperial succession proved to be Claudius, Caligula's uncle, whose physical disabilities and apparent intellectual limitations had protected him from involvement in his nephew's crimes, while making him seem like a safe choice for senators who wanted an emperor strong enough to maintain order, but weak enough to allow meaningful senatorial participation in governmental decisions. But even this apparently ideal solution carried risks, as Claudius's legitimacy would ultimately depend on acceptance by the same military forces that had enabled 4 years of systematic tyranny. The negotiations that resulted in Claudius's elevation to imperial authority revealed the continuing influence of the institutional dynamics that had enabled Caligula's rise, as political leaders found themselves once again choosing emperors based primarily on their capacity to manage military loyalty rather than their commitment to constitutional principles or administrative competence. The restoration of legitimate government was proving to be far more complex than the elimination of illegitimate tyranny, requiring systematic reforms that went far beyond simple personnel changes. The process of accounting for crimes committed during Caligula's reign presented additional challenges that threatened to destabilize the new government before it could establish effective authority over institutions that had been systematically corrupted through years of collaboration with evil. The demand for justice from victims and their families conflicted with the practical necessity of maintaining cooperation from officials whose administrative expertise was essential for governmental continuity, but whose past actions had made them morally complicit in various atrocities. The most difficult cases involved senators and other high-ranking officials who had participated enthusiastically in legitimizing policies they privately recognized as criminal, but whose prosecution would eliminate much of the experienced leadership necessary for rebuilding effective governmental institutions. The compromise solutions that emerged satisfied no one completely, while establishing precedents that future tyrants might exploit to protect their own collaborators from post-regime accountability. The economic consequences of Caligula's fiscal policies created additional pressures that threatened the stability of the new government, as the treasury had been systematically depleted through expenditures on projects that served no practical purpose except satisfying imperial megalomania, while the taxation systems designed to fund these projects had pushed many citizens to the brink of financial ruin. The restoration of fiscal responsibility required painful adjustments that risked creating popular resentment against the new regime despite its obvious moral superiority to its predecessor. The massive construction projects that had consumed unprecedented resources during the previous reign presented particular challenges, as their abandonment would represent enormous waste, while their completion would require continued taxation at levels that citizens had tolerated only because of fear rather than genuine acceptance of governmental legitimacy. The new emperor found himself forced to make decisions about resource allocation that would inevitably disappoint significant constituencies regardless of the choices made. The international implications of regime change in Rome created diplomatic challenges that required careful management to prevent foreign powers from exploiting imperial instability to advance their own territorial or commercial interests at Roman expense. Client kingdoms that had adjusted their policies to accommodate Caligula's religious innovations needed reassurance that the new government would honour existing treaties, while abandoning the theological requirements that had created so much resistance throughout the empire. The most sensitive diplomatic issues involved territories where imperial policies had generated genuine rebellions that had been suppressed through military force, as the new government needed to balance demands for justice from populations that had suffered under Caligula's rule against the practical necessity of maintaining imperial authority over provinces whose continued loyalty was essential for overall stability of the Roman system. The religious restoration process proved particularly complex, as 4 years of systematic theological innovation had created new institutional relationships and doctrinal frameworks that could not simply be abolished without creating spiritual vacuum that might be filled by even more problematic religious movements. The priests and temple administrators who had enthusiastically supported emperor worship found themselves needing to demonstrate renewed loyalty to traditional gods while explaining away their previous collaboration with policies they now claimed to have always opposed privately. The cultural impact of Caligula's reign would prove to be the most lasting legacy of his brief but transformative rule, as the systematic corruption of moral and aesthetic standards had created changes in Roman society that could not be reversed through simple governmental decree. The normalization of extreme violence as entertainment, the acceptance of incest as divine prerogative, the celebration of cruelty as strength, these psychological and cultural transformations would influence Roman civilization for generations to come, creating vulnerabilities that future tyrants would exploit with even greater sophistication than Caligula had achieved. But perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of the assassination was the precedent it established for military intervention in imperial succession, demonstrating that even absolute power could be challenged successfully by determined conspirators who possessed sufficient courage and competence to eliminate tyrants whose continued rule threatened the fundamental values of Roman civilization. this precedent would influence political calculations for centuries, creating both deterrent effects that might restrain future imperial excess and destabilizing possibilities that ambitious generals might exploit for their own purposes. As the immediate crisis of succession was resolved, and Claudius began the long process of rebuilding governmental institutions that had been systematically corrupted through years of collaboration with evil, thoughtful Romans understood that their civilization had passed through a test that had revealed both its fundamental weaknesses and its ultimate resilience in the face of challenges that had threatened its complete moral collapse. The empire that emerged from Caligula's reign was permanently changed by the experience of systematic tyranny, but it had also demonstrated that even the most absolute power contained within itself the seeds of its own destruction when wielded by individuals who lack the wisdom and restraint necessary for sustainable governance of complex societies populated by human beings who retained some capacity for moral judgment and collective resistance to evil. The age of divine madness was over, but its lessons would echo through the corridors of power for as long as Rome endured, serving as both warning and inspiration for future generations who would face their own choices between collaboration with evil and the dangerous but necessary work of resistance that civilization sometimes demanded from its most courageous citizens. The monster was dead, but the empire lived on, scarred but not destroyed, corrupted but not beyond redemption, a civilization that had learned the ultimate cost of unlimited power and the ultimate value of those who possessed the courage to say no when saying yes would have been safer but morally impossible. In the end, Rome had saved itself not through the wisdom of its institutions or the virtue of its leaders, but through the simple recognition that some things were worth dying for, and that among those things was the right to live in a world where power served justice rather than the other way around. The Bedside Historian closes this dark chapter with a reminder that echoes across the centuries. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, but it can never corrupt completely. For there will always be those who choose honour over safety, duty over comfort, and the dangerous work of resistance over the easy path of collaboration with evil. Sleep well, if you can. At the end, thank you for joining us for this dark journey through the reign of Caligula. Subscribe for more stories from history's darkest corners, where we explore the monsters that wear human faces and the heroes who dare to stand against them.